The year is 1665, and Isaac Newton is looking out his window at an apple tree standing tall in his orchard in Lincolnshire, England. All of a sudden, a ripe and lonely apple falls from the tree and makes its way to the ground. While most people would consider this a mundane event, Newton followed its trajectory with great interest. What young Isaac didn't know at the time was that this apple would become the most famous piece of fruit in human history, as its natural attraction to the ground would spark a moment of genius, leading him to create the laws of motion that revolutionized modern physics. Newton wasn't conducting an experiment when he discovered the laws of gravity. He wasn't overloading his brain with information trying to figure it out. He was simply looking aimlessly outside his window. He was bored. But that was in the 17th century. Times have changed a lot since then. These days, we hardly ever allow ourselves to just stare out a window or sit in our backyards doing nothing but staring at the sky. We never pause for a moment and just let our minds wander into deep, unexplored territories. Turns out that diving deep into our own thoughts is something that we don't really like to do. We find it boring and will do anything to alleviate boredom, even if it means subjecting ourselves to self-inflicted electric shocks. This, sadly, is not an exaggeration. In a study conducted at the University of Virginia, a social psychologist named Timothy Wilson recruited hundreds of student volunteers to take part in what he called thinking periods. Individuals were placed in small rooms with blank walls and no personal belongings. They were asked to entertain themselves with nothing but their thoughts for just 6 to 15 minutes. When asked to rate their experience afterwards, about 50% of the volunteers did not like being alone with their thoughts, citing it was boring. Then, researchers left the volunteers in the room for another 15 minutes. This time, though, they introduced a button that participants could press to shock themselves if they wanted to. Around 67% of men and 25% of women chose to voluntarily inflict pain on themselves rather than just sit and do nothing. This research suggests that, sadly, a lot of us would rather experience physical pain than sit in our own thoughts. When left with nothing else to do, most of us immediately grab our phones, switching from one app to the other, as the algorithms of the internet feed us with the exact content that'll keep us from being bored. One of the biggest problems with AI is that it's really difficult to understand what's going on. It's as if we're at the mercy of a few Silicon Valley companies to explain to us how the thing they've created works, and you can bet they'll only explain it in a way that favors them. But this doesn't have to be the case anymore. You don't have to have a 4-year degree or work in Silicon Valley to understand how AI tools like ChatGPT work, thanks to Brilliant.org, the sponsor of today's episode. I recently took Brilliant's How Large Language Models Work, and it taught me everything about how generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Google's Gemini work. Although it's a very complex subject, Brilliant made it super easy for me to understand, thanks to the fun and interactive features the course has. Brilliant offers thousands of other courses on different concepts like logic, math, and computer science. Every course is designed by an award-winning team of researchers, teachers, and industry experts, so you can rest assured knowing you're getting the most up-to-date and industry-relevant information. Brilliant's courses are broken down into small pieces, which makes it super easy to learn using their app wherever you are. If you're interested in trying out the course on AI or any other course that Brilliant has to offer, you can do so completely for free for 30 days by going to brilliant.org/aperture or clicking the link at the top of the description, which also gives you a 20% discount on an annual premium subscription. In the spring and summer of 1665, an outbreak of bubonic plague spread through London and, by July, had claimed more than 17,000 lives. Almost at once, people throughout the city began fleeing to the countryside, isolating themselves in fear for their lives. Among those who fled was none other than Sir Isaac Newton. Of course, at that time, Newton had not yet been knighted. In fact, he had not yet even witnessed the famous apple falling. Interestingly, though, his 2 years spent in isolation, away from the bells, whistles, and distractions of the city, was the time when Newton's genius came to life, and he was able to invent calculus, create the science of motion, and develop a framework for gravity. These 2 years spent in quarantine were Newton's own 15 minutes isolated in a room with nothing to do. Newton, however, didn't seek external stimuli to prevent his mind from wandering. Instead, he welcomed the boredom that often comes with deep thinking and stared out the window, which has, without a doubt, paid dividends for all of humanity. During this isolation in the countryside, Newton also invented calculus. Throughout his life, he also made major discoveries in optics, proposing that white light is actually a combination of light from all of the color spectrum, Most famously, following his Apple incident, he developed the 3 laws of motion. In all fairness, attributing Newton's greatest accomplishments to him being quarantined in the countryside is a bit misleading. The truth is, the incident of the apple falling wasn't an isolated moment of genius. Newton's various contributions to science were the product of years of hard work and dedication, tediously working towards these moments of revelation. However, it is still helpful to recognize the importance of solitude and boredom in creating that particular eureka moment. According to psychologist Dr. Sandy Mann of the University of Central Lancashire, once we start daydreaming and allow our brains to wander like Newton did when he looked out the window, we start thinking beyond the conscious and into the subconscious, which allows for all sorts of connections to take place. This is called the default mode. When you're bored or performing mundane tasks like doing the dishes or folding the laundry, your body may be on autopilot, but your brain is actually pretty busy. When in the default mode, your mind gets the chance to connect to different ideas, try and solve some of your most pressing problems, and even create personal narratives or set goals. This is why programmers often tell you that they figured out their problem with their code just as they were jumping into bed, ready to get some shut-eye, or why you feel like your best ideas come when you jump in the shower. The problem is that today, those are the very rare moments that we allow ourselves to be bored. Every other time, we almost always choose the electric shock method. Living in a society where we have the entire world of entertainment on our fingertips has led to our immediate dissatisfaction with even seconds of boredom. The more we fill our world with fast-moving, high-intensity stimulation, the more we get used to it, and the less of a tolerance we have for boredom. On average, Americans reach for their phones 344 times a day. That's once every 4 minutes. From quick email checks to diving down the rabbit hole of reels and memes, Americans spend an average of 2 hours and 54 minutes on their phone each day, with some people clocking up to 10 hours a day on their phones. Without a doubt, technology has definitely made the world a better place, but this unhealthy, dependent relationship we have with our phones is robbing us of our most creative selves. German psychologist Theodor Lipps proposed one of the first definitions of boredom in 1903, saying, "Boredom is a feeling of displeasure arising out of conflict between a need for intense mental activity and lack of incitement to it, or inability to be incited." In other words, it's an underwhelming state where none of the options available to us seem appealing. Instead of letting this feeling run its course, we overstimulate our brain and prevent it from taking advantage of the true power of this downtime. Our first instinct when we experience boredom is to just endlessly scroll through feeds, swishing through social media apps, even when we're walking from one room to the next or waiting for the cashier to bag our groceries. We've become conditioned to constantly seek out novelty and deliver a hit of dopamine to our brain. Sadly, once that sense of novelty fades, it leaves behind a stronger feeling of boredom, which we then try to get rid of with even more stimulation. It's a vicious cycle that keeps our brain occupied. Mindless entertainment designed to capture our attention for the longest time possible. Studies have shown that, when given tasks that require minimum mental capacity, participants often contemplated their future and their plans for it. On the other hand, if your brain is constantly consumed by stimuli, it'll rarely have the time to think of the bigger picture and is less likely to set goals for the future or to be more creative. A 2017 study from Georgia Institute of Technology measured the brain patterns of more than 100 people. Participants were asked to focus on a stationary point while they lay in a MRI machine. The goal was to figure out which areas of the brain worked together during an awake but resting state. The team compared the data with questionnaires that the participants filled out about how much their minds wandered in daily life. It turns out participants who had reported more frequent daydreaming scored higher on intellectual and creative ability and had more efficient brain systems recorded on the MRI. These findings are supported by a lot of artists when discussing their creative process. In his book Creative Quest, music producer and drummer for The Roots, Questlove, wrote about his battle against the many distractions available to us in today's world. On the face of it, it doesn't make any sense. Boredom seems like the least creative feeling, but it's actually a way of clearing space for a new idea to spring back up. Similarly, J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series, formulated all the ideas for her book in a 4-hour train ride from Manchester to London. If she had an iPad and binge-watched her favorite Netflix show instead, she probably wouldn't have brought Harry in his magical world to life. In his book Daily Rituals, Mason Curry studied the routines of hundreds of other artists, writers, and creatives, and concluded that boredom is a recurring theme that leads to the mind wandering and having a kind of diffused focus which allows for creative production. This diffused state is when the mind enters its default mode and comes up with its best work. Perhaps the best proof of this truth is none other than Albert Einstein himself. Einstein took over where Newton left off and gave us a more advanced definition of gravity with the notion of a curved spacetime. Einstein was known for his extremely vivid imagination and inspired thought experiments that allowed him to define time as the fourth dimension, and to change our understanding of the mechanics of the universe itself. Many people believe that the seeds of his genius were planted during the year he took off from high school in the 1890s, when he simply wandered without purpose and contemplated the world, free from any external pressures. Throughout his life, Einstein would take regular walks to clear his mind, and in a letter he wrote to his friends while sailing in 1932, he said, "A cruise in the sea is an excellent opportunity for maximum calm and reflection on ideas from a different perspective." It was clear that he knew the importance of sitting still and letting the mind wander. Our history is full of many great thinkers who have been conscious enough to take advantage of their downtime and utilize it in the name of creative production. Psychologists today encourage parents to allow their children to be bored instead of occupying all their time watching YouTube on their tablets. The idea is to give the young minds the time and space needed to discover, create, and find their own genius. Teaching people, especially kids, how to use technology to improve their lives while also self-regulating their exposure to it should be a crucial part of digital literacy. There's a saying used in tech: when the product is free, you are the product. Our attention is being fought for by a magnitude of applications, and at the end of the day, we're left with no time to just sit and contemplate on our own life and experiences. But that shouldn't be the case. Next time you find yourself reaching for your phone when you're bored, remember, you're choosing to voluntarily shock yourself, instead of looking out the window and contemplating on your own metaphorical apple falling from the tree. You'd be surprised what your mind can achieve when you just allow it to wander for a moment. People controlling the world, these names come to mind. But the truth is, while these people have a significant influence over our lives, 4 companies secretly control the world, and only a handful of people hold significant power in those companies. These are the people who have the potential to change your life for better or worse, without you ever realizing what's happening. I made a video talking about how BlackRock controls the world, and unsurprisingly, they are one of the 4 companies we'll discuss today. Altogether, these 4 companies manage almost $24 trillion worth of assets. They have the most influence over the United States' monetary policy and operate with very little oversight, which means they're free to do almost anything they want. And their power doesn't end in the United States. These companies also own a significant stake in the vast majority of European companies that are listed on the US stock exchange. Now, you might think this is an exaggeration. How can 4 companies control so much wealth? But it is true, and the information is available once you just look for it. From the largest retail stores like Walmart and Home Depot to transportation companies like GMC and Boeing, pharmaceutical companies like Merck, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and media companies like Disney, Viacom, News Corp, NBC, CBS, Time Warner, and AT&T. They influence the banking system as they're involved in every decision made at the largest financial institutions like Bank of America, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup. In the United States, the US Federal Reserve, the country's central banking institution, has board members who represent these 4 investment firms. Global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are influenced heavily by these companies. So, who exactly are these 4 companies? Before I answer the question, when researching this topic, I was bombarded with a lot of data. The largest of the 4 companies, BlackRock, was founded in 1988 by Larry Fink. Like the other 3 firms, BlackRock is a fiduciary, which means that a person has placed trust in them to act in their best financial interest. BlackRock does this primarily through mutual funds, a collection of assets that invest in stocks, bonds, and other securities like real estate. BlackRock currently has 70 offices in 30 countries around the globe and holds $10 trillion in assets. The company is currently worth $20 trillion, which is half of the US's yearly gross domestic product, or GDP. This is the measure of value created by a country by producing goods and services. The other 3 companies are Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity Investments. Vanguard manages $7.6 trillion in assets and is the world's largest issuer of mutual funds. At the end of 2022, it had 203 US funds and 227 international funds, which served its 50 million investors. Vanguard's founder, John Bogle, created the Index Investment Fund in 1976, now known as the Vanguard 500 Index Fund. You might be wondering the difference between an index and a mutual fund. An index fund is a type of mutual fund that is passively managed as opposed to other mutual funds, which are actively managed. So when Bogle invented this index fund, he created a formula to track returns on the market and invest accordingly. State Street is owned by Vanguard now, but is the second oldest continually operating US bank. Its predecessor, Union Bank, was founded in 1792. State Street manages $3.9 trillion in investment assets. Along with Vanguard and BlackRock, it is one of the prominent 3 index fund managers that dominate corporate America. Fidelity Investments manages $4.3 trillion in assets. It was founded by Edward Johnson II in 1946 and has remained a family-owned and operated business ever since. Fidelity was the first major American finance firm to market mutual funds to everyone via mail and door-to-door sales. Before they opened their doors, the mere idea of investing had been reserved for wealthy individuals. Hearing that alone, you might be wondering what exactly is wrong with these companies. They all sound like industry pioneers who have done incredible to stay in business for so long. And while that is entirely right, it's only half the story. To figure out the other half, let's start with what these companies tell us they do. Each of these firms helps everyday people invest their money, and whether you're a multimillionaire or an hourly worker looking to create a small investment fund for your family, they've helped democratize investing. And often, investing with them can seem like a good idea, especially lately, because in today's world, we're not just worried about making money, we're concerned about making money and helping move society forward. That's where ESG investing comes in. ESG, which stands for Environmental Social Governance, is a type of investing that considers social and environmental factors. So basically, what is the company you're investing in doing about environmental issues like climate change? All 4 of these firms advertise their commitment to ESG. As you would expect, some people have mocked these firms' stance on ESG, calling it woke investing. In response, companies like BlackRock have responded by saying it's not woke, it's capitalism. The way they see it, climate change poses a risk, so investing in companies that further the effects of climate change is also a risk. On the flip side, investing in companies trying to mitigate that risk is good business. To give them all the credit, they've put their money where their mouths are. In 2021, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street successfully shook up the board of ExxonMobil by installing new members who promised to take on climate change. And BlackRock let the state of West Virginia, a huge coal producer, pull out of the investment firm due to their pledge to invest in net zero companies. But when you peel back the curtain, it's not as wholesome as these firms would like to make it sound, especially when it comes to ESG investing. Every single one of these companies is about as hypocritical as they get. Vanguard specifically praises its own ESG investing, while also owning $86 billion in coal companies, making it the world's largest investor in the industry. BlackRock is the top investor in fossil fuels and deforestation, war profiteering, and doing business with human rights violators. Look no further than BlackRock's deal with the Chinese government. The firm became the first company to have access to China's vast mutual fund market, followed by Fidelity. This left many skeptics wondering, what did they promise President Xi Jinping? With this deal, these 2 companies will be pouring more and more money into the Chinese companies, which are primarily controlled by the Chinese government, a growing adversary of Western democracies. Even more controversial are the firm's investments in Russia. All of these companies had assets invested in Russian companies, and once the war broke out in Ukraine, they all responded, at least publicly, by freezing those investments or pulling out of them altogether. Whether or not those assets will stay out of Russia long-term is questionable. Regardless, years and years of investments from these 4 companies undoubtedly helped fund Putin's invasion of Ukraine. No matter how you slice it, these companies are riddled with conflicts of interest. In Ukraine, BlackRock is one of the leaders trying to advise the country on rebuilding once the conflict is resolved. This might seem benevolent, but not all that glitters is gold. In reality, BlackRock is simply capitalizing on a war that their funds helped finance so they can make more money closer to home than the others. The Johnson family, which founded and runs Fidelity, also runs a venture capital arm that competes with Fidelity's investments, which means the family benefits, while Fidelity investors get a crappy deal. For example, from 2011 to 2012, F Prime Capital, the family's venture capital arm, invested $11 million in Ultragenyx Pharmaceutical Incorporated before it went public. This investment prevented Fidelity's mutual funds from making the same play because, if it did, it would have violated US securities laws, so the family-owned fund got the better stock value while the public funds, which invested in the company at a higher rate, kind of got screwed. Essentially, these companies, which have immense power and control in our world, tell us a manicured PR statement about what they're doing, but in reality the story is much more complicated and problematic.
None of their success would have been possible without the various proprietary technologies they developed to help their investing strategies. The prime example is BlackRock's Aladdin technology, which began the trend of using technology to minimize the risk of investing. It manages $20 trillion in assets and predicts the outcome of every single investment while getting information and personal data on everyone who knowingly or unknowingly gave BlackRock their money. This technology and others like it are perfect for investors. They've helped to lower the cost of managing the investment while improving returns. This type of technology is what makes companies like BlackRock and others grow. It gives them an edge. It allows them to apply their investing strategy company-wide. It'll enable investors to diversify their portfolios more effectively. Technologies like this democratize investing, allowing anyone of any level of wealth to benefit from a sound investment strategy. This is why over 80% of all assets invested over the last decade have gone to these four companies, but at what cost? And if these companies continue to revolutionize, advance their technologies, and control more and more investor assets, then what? We're at risk of ownership concentration if BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, and State Street continue increasing their influence over the biggest companies across every industry. Competition's just gonna decrease. They'll be competing with themselves, which isn't competing at all. This leads to less consumer choice and higher prices, and we can see this already happening in the airline industry. Over the last 14 years, airfares have increased by as much as 7% because there's less pressure to compete. BlackRock and Vanguard are among the 5 largest shareholders of the biggest 3 operators. But this isn't just about the companies, it's about the people who run and own them. The people who make the decisions, pull the levers, and hold so much power you can't imagine. Starting with Larry Fink, the founder, chairman, and CEO of BlackRock. He started out at a New York-based investment bank where he rose to manage the firm's bond department. Unfortunately, his career there ended when he lost his department $100 million after an incorrect prediction about interest rates. This led him to focus his next venture on investing in risk management, and BlackRock was born. He founded the firm in 1988 and grew it from $5 million to $8 billion in just 5 years. Abigail Johnson, CEO of Fidelity Investments, didn't grow the company she leads from the ground up. She's the granddaughter of Fidelity's founder, Edward Johnson II. She started as an analyst and portfolio manager at the company before being promoted to the president of Fidelity's asset management division. In this position in the early 2000s, like an episode of Succession, Johnson unsuccessfully attempted to remove her father as CEO over disagreements about how to lead the company. It wouldn't take too long for her time to come though, as in 2014 she was named CEO. State Street CEO Ronald O'Hanley has ties to Fidelity, having previously served as the president of asset management and corporate services there before entering his current role. The world of finance is a lot smaller than you think. And Vanguard, uniquely, is owned by its clients, or instead by the funds they invest in. Its president and CEO Mortimer J. Buckley started his career as an assistant to the company's founder John Bogle. Bogle, the guy who essentially invented the index fund, may not like the direction his business is going in. He's warned of ownership concentration, saying that too much money is in too few hands. Undoubtedly, asset management has made Mr. Bogle a very wealthy man, but perhaps he sees beyond that. Maybe he understands the power he and others like him have over every industry they invest in, and every investor who entrusts them. He may be issuing a warning to us all, but it's not one we're likely able to do anything about. Because these 4 companies are just too influential. A global financial system meant to empower individual investors has empowered a select few instead. So while we get distracted by celebrities' faces on the front of magazines or flashing by in our social media posts, these company leaders are behind the scenes, pulling the levers and secretly deciding the financial future of our world, whether we like it or not. The worst of them all is BlackRock. Watch this video next to understand why.
As of 2019, 96% of deepfakes on the internet were sexual in nature, and virtually all of those were of non-consenting women. With the release of AI tools like DALL-E and Midjourney, making these deepfakes has become easier than ever before, and the repercussions for the women involved are much more devastating. Recently, a teacher in a small town in the United States was fired after her likeness appeared in an adult video. Parents of the students found the video and made it clear they didn't want this woman teaching their kids. She was immediately dismissed from her position. But this woman never actually filmed an explicit video. Generative AI created a likeness of her and deepfaked it onto the body of an adult film actress. She pleaded her innocence, but the parents of the students couldn't wrap their heads around how a video like this could be faked. They refused to believe her. And honestly, it's hard to blame them. We've all seen just how good generative AI can be. This incident, and many others just like it, prove how dangerous AI adult content is, and if left unchecked, it could be so much worse. The truth is, the technology itself isn't the problem, it's the way people are using it and the lack of regulations surrounding its use. At first glance, AI pornography might seem harmless. If we can generate other forms of content without human actors, why not this one? Surely it may reduce work in the field, but it could also curb more problematic issues in the industry. If the AI was used to create artificial people, it wouldn't be so bad, but the problem is that the generative AI has been mainly used with deepfakes to convince viewers that the person they're watching is a specific, real person, someone who never consented to be in the video. Speaking of consent, by convincingly portraying women in suggestive situations, the perpetrators commit sexual acts or behaviors without the victim's permission, and that, by definition, is sexual assault. But does using generative AI to produce these videos cause any actual harm beyond being defined as assault? For the victims involved, there are numerous consequences to being portrayed in these videos.
This is what it looks like to see yourself naked against your will being spread all over the internet.
QTC Cinderella is a Twitch streamer who built a massive following for her gaming, baking, and lifestyle content. She also created the Streamer Awards that honor her fellow content creators, one of whom was Brandon Ewing, aka Atrioc. In January of 2023, Atrioc was live streaming when his viewers saw a tab open on his browser for a deepfake website. After getting screenshotted and posted on Reddit, users found that the site address featured deepfakes videos of streamers like QTC Cinderella doing explicit sexual acts. Cinderella began getting harassed by these images and videos, and after seeing them she said, "The amount of body dysmorphia I've experienced seeing those photos has ruined me. It's not as simple as just being violated, it's so much more than that." For months afterwards, QTC Cinderella was constantly harassed with these reminders of these images and videos. Some horrible people sent the photos to her 17-year-old cousin. And this isn't a one-off case. Perpetrators of deepfakes are known to send these videos to family members of the victims, especially if they don't like what the victim is doing publicly. The founder of Not Your Porn, a group dedicated to removing non-consensual porn from the internet, was targeted by internet trolls using AI-generated videos depicting her in explicit acts. Then somebody sent these videos to her family members. Just imagine how terrible that must feel for her and her relatives. The sad truth is that even when a victim can discredit the videos, the harm might already be done. A deepfake can hurt someone's career at a pivotal moment. Cinderella was able to get back on her feet and retain her following, but the school teacher, who lost her livelihood, wasn't so lucky. Imagine someone running for office and leading in the polls only to be targeted with a deepfake video 24 hours before election night. Imagine how much damage could be done before their team could prove that the video was doctored. Unfortunately, there's very little legislation on deepfakes, and so far only 3 states in the US have passed laws to address them directly. Even with these laws, the technology makes it difficult to track down the people who create them. Also, because most of them post on their personal websites rather than social media, there's no regulations or content moderation limits on what they can share. Since tracking and prosecuting the individuals who make this kind of content is so challenging, the onus should be on the companies that make these tools to prevent them from being used for evil. And in fairness, some of them are trying. Platforms like Dolly and Midjourney have taken steps to prevent people from creating the likeness of a living person. Reddit is also working to improve its AI detection system and has already made considerable strides in prohibiting this content on its platform. These efforts are important, but I'm not sure they'll completely eliminate the threat of deepfakes. More generative AI tools are coming on the scene and will require new moderation efforts, and eventually some of these platforms won't care, especially if that gives them an edge over well-established platforms. And then there's the sheer influx of uploaded content. In 2022, Pornhub received over 2 million video uploads to its site. That number will likely increase with new AI tools that can generate content without needing a physical camera. How can any moderation system keep up with that insane volume? The worst thing about these deepfakes is that the victims can't just log off of the internet either. Almost all of our livelihoods depend on the internet, so logging off would be an enormous disadvantage in their careers and personal life. And expecting anyone to leave the internet to protect themselves isn't a reasonable ask. The onus isn't on the victim to change, it's on the platforms and the government to create tools that prevent these things from happening so easily. If all the women who are being harassed went offline, the trolls would win, and this tactic of theirs would be incredibly successful. They could effectively silence critics and whoever they felt like attacking. There's another problem with generative AI tools producing so much adult content. It introduces strong biases to the algorithms and how women should be presented. Many women have reported that they're often over-sexualized when they try to create an image of themselves using AI tools.
These biases are introduced by the source of the AI's training data, the internet. Although nudes and explicit images have been filtered out for some generative AI platforms, these biases still persist. These platforms have to do more than just let the open internet train their AI if they want to prevent the overt sexualization of women to be their normal output. Deepfakes may be making headlines now, but the truth is they've been around in spirit for a very long time. Before generative AI, people used tools like Photoshop and video editing software to superimpose celebrities' heads on the bodies of adult film actors. Broadly, these doctored videos weren't compelling, but the things are now very different with AI. We're careening dangerously close to a point where we can no longer discern the real from the fake. French postmodern philosopher Baudrillard warned of a moment when we can no longer distinguish between reality and a simulation. Humans use technology to navigate a complex reality. We invented maps to guide us through an intricate mass of land. Eventually, we created mass media to understand the world around us and help simplify its complexity. But there will be a point where we lose track of reality, a point when we're spending more time looking at a simulation of the world on our phone than we will be participating in the real world around us, and we're almost there now. With generative AI, our connection to reality is even further disconnected. Because technology can convincingly replicate reality on our devices, we're less inclined to go outside and see what's real for ourselves. This inability of human consciousness is to distinguish what is real and what is simulation is what Baudrillard called hyperreality, a state that leaves us vulnerable to malicious manipulation, from things like deepfakes to people getting fired to propaganda leading to the loss of millions of lives. You might remember that a couple of years ago there were numerous PSAs, often from celebrities, warning us to keep an eye out for deepfakes. They were annoying, but ultimately, they succeeded in making the public hyper-aware of fake videos. But not so much with the deepfake adult content. Maybe it's because the PSAs about deepfakes didn't mention pornography, they addressed fake speeches by presidents and famous people instead. Or maybe it's because those who consume this content don't care whether it's real or fake. They're okay with the illusion. One thing is true though, if the general public was trained to recognize deepfake pornography, the potential for harm would be limited. By being more critical as information consumers and reporting these harmful videos when we see them, we might be able to curb the effects of this dangerous new medium. It's not like we're strangers to being critical of what we see and read online. When Wikipedia was first introduced, the idea that it could be a legitimate source of information was laughable. It was mocked on sitcoms and late-night television. It symbolized the absurdity of believing what you read on the internet. That perception changed with time, deservedly so for Wikipedia, but we had a healthy skepticism towards user-generated internet platforms for a while. The question is, can we be critical and discerning towards deepfakes while acknowledging that some content is real? Will we lose track of what's simulation and what's reality and just distrust whatever we see online? Or worse, will manipulators succeed in making deepfake-inflicted suffering an everyday occurrence, and we end up accepting that as the cost of existing online? And is there any hope of regulation stopping the constant assault of generative AI on our well-being? One thing's become clear since ChatGPT and DALL-E started making headlines last year, and it's that AI will inevitably replace a lot of what humans currently do. It can already convincingly replicate human communication and human design, and our inability to distinguish between human output and AI output has created a laundry list of problems that will be challenging to address. Already, businesses are using ChatGPT's writing capabilities in their marketing and sales departments. It's even possible that we'll be watching AI-written TV shows soon. For writers, that's your dream job and your day job both vanishing overnight. And then there will be all the opportunities for deception using AI. Like, imagine what phishing scams there'll be in a year when scammers can easily fabricate videos and audio of anyone you know. People with ill intent can create content to cause others real harm. And right now, that's AI-generated adult videos inflicting pain against women. If we're unable to tell what's real and what's an AI-generated fake, humanity has a tough road ahead. And I'm not sure any of us are ready for it. In 1994, the CEO of the tobacco company R.J. Reynolds, James W. Johnston, told the United States Congress that cigarette smoking is no more addictive than coffee, tea, or Twinkies. Sure, there might be some out there who might have a steady stream of Twinkies entering their stomach, but I feel like we can all agree that despite the stomach ache and probably risk for diabetes, this sugar-happy habit isn't nearly as dangerous as smoking cigarettes. For years, the tobacco industry assured customers that cigarettes weren't unhealthy or addictive and they made billions doing it. But in reality, about 480,000 Americans die every year from cigarettes, to say nothing of the global death rate.
4 years after Johnston made his famously false comparison, the 4 largest tobacco companies reached a settlement with 46 US states to pay $206 billion over 25 years to help cover medical costs of smoking-related illnesses. They lied, and now we all know why they did. While the corporate lie about cigarettes feels particularly egregious, companies, governments, and even well-intentioned people lie to us in more subtle ways every single day. Think back to job interviews you might have had. You might have heard the phrase, "Our employees are our most valuable asset," and it probably feels good to hear that. You want to work at a place that values you, yet layoffs happen all the time. Sure, they're usually veiled as reorgs or some other corporate jargon to tell you that you're just no longer needed. It's not personal, it's just business. And even when you get to keep your job, salaries remain stagnant, and sometimes they even drop with the ebbs and flows of the economy. Look no further than the wave of strikes around the globe this summer, with labor unions like the United Auto Workers proclaiming, "No, employees clearly aren't a company's most valuable asset." These statements by corporations are meant to make employees feel heard and respected. They're similar to statements like, "Your responses will be confidential" when you're being asked to take a survey about the company's performance or your team. It might seem suspect. Is it really anonymous? Probably not, because companies aren't legally bound to respect statements of confidentiality. They tend to scuttle laws that force them to keep employee information private. Management at whatever level is most likely looking at whatever confidential statements you make on a survey or otherwise. Or what about meritocracy? How many times have you heard that your company or team is a meritocracy, where the most talented, the smartest, the hardest working individuals rise to the top? It's nice to believe this because it makes us feel like if we work our butts off and develop our skills, then we'll get promoted, get raises, and advance in the way we always hoped we would. But being real, whatever industry you're working in, those promotions and raises often have to do more with networking and connections than actual hard work. Sometimes the best candidates get rewarded, but in many cases it's all about who you know. Relationships you built on the job were the ones you came into the job with, so work hard, but also get connected. These kind of corporate lies are general, things companies say to keep workers happy. But then there's more specific lies that are meant to persuade employees of a certain position. Companies like to make us think that our jobs are dependent on low corporate taxes, and it's true that corporate tax rates around the globe tend to be high. But even in the United States, we're at 35%. It's actually lower than a lot of other countries around the world. Corporations have developed systems of tax credits and subsidies to avoid paying that amount, or even close to it. The claim that a low corporate tax rate leads to more jobs for workers is mostly just a farce. Just like the claim that union forces jobs overseas, and yes, unions do lead to increased labor costs, but millions of non-union jobs are also sent overseas, so the problem doesn't really lie in unionization. It lies in the power of globalization. Computer programmers were never unionized, but most tech firms have moved their operations to India and China. The reality is that unions create a shift in power, away from management. In some cases, unions do create problems. Corruption, among other things, but when working properly, they limit and hold management accountable for the decisions that impact their employees. To demonize unions and tie it to the decline of domestic jobs is a tactic. Not a tactic to keep jobs on home soil, but to stop workers from unionizing in the first place. When we commit to a job or to working with a certain company on a project, we're usually informed of the company's core values. We get a long list of vague words like loyalty and sustainability, but what is any company's true core value? Money. In the best of workplaces, other values might follow, but money, no matter what, usually tops them all. Companies might give to charitable causes, but mostly because it improves their branding and helps with tax deductions. They'll limit their environmental impact when it improves their costs, but probably not just because they love Mother Earth so much. The use of core values is an example of the law of inverse relevancy, which tells us that the less someone plans on doing something, the more they talk about it. We all have the friend who can't stop talking about the exercise plan that they're about to start, but the question always remains, when? The fact that companies lie ultimately isn't really surprising, but seeing it in action can be a pretty wild experience. Just before we see this in action, the best way to combat misinformation is to learn how the world works. For example, by learning how AI works, we can understand when companies are hiding under that term
to carry out their shady business practices. In 2020, the leaders of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google testified in front of an antitrust panel at the US House of Representatives. The goal of the panel was to poke holes in big tech's argument that they're not monopolies. The titans of the tech industry told lie after lie that we either just ignore as consumers or decide that we want to believe. Like the lie that users are in control of their data. Google CEO Sundar Pichai said that the company has simplified its settings for users, and this is true. They offer many privacy options, but simple isn't really a word to describe them. Just because an airplane has a lot of controls doesn't mean that anyone can fly it. The reality is that most of us have little to no understanding of what companies do with our data. They want us to think that their having access to our data creates a better experience for us. And sure, it's nice when Instagram feeds you an ad for those sneakers you've been searching for, but the data collection isn't about getting you new shoes. It's about giving companies power to make money, specifically by selling those ads. Advertising helps big tech grow, and we can all agree that they have grown. One of the claims made in this hearing was that these massive companies aren't even that big. Amazon claimed it holds less than 1% of the global retail market and less than 4% of retail in the United States. But that's counting all retail, even gas stations. I don't know about you, but I don't really consider that shopping. Similarly, Facebook claimed that it competes with all products that connect people, not just any social media companies. And Apple insisted that it doesn't have a dominant share in any market or product category. But if you have an iPhone, you know you have to go through Apple to buy apps or services on the device. Of course, it's not like the government who was listening to these claims doesn't do its fair share of lying to us as well. The US government has repeatedly lied to citizens to justify war. In 1998, the Clinton administration bombed what it told the public was a chemical weapons factory in Sudan that turned out to be a pharmaceutical factory. Then famously, the Bush administration cooked up a web of false information to convince us all that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, the basis for the Iraq War. The most famous incident of the American government lying to perpetuate war came during Vietnam. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked and published. They showed that the government had systematically lied to cover up the fact that the United States was losing ground in Vietnam. In the 1960s, while the war was still going on, US officials insisted that the Viet Cong were dying in record numbers and that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. They called for more force, even though, as the Pentagon Papers told us, they knew the reality of what was happening, that the US was losing the war. There is, of course, a certain amount of government secrecy that's pretty much necessary for national security. False assurances aren't just for the public, they're meant to mislead adversaries and to cover up mistakes and failures that might make a country seem weak or incapable. So your government might be lying to protect you. But at what point are we supposed to believe what they say? Are we meant to think that every lie is in service of our own protection? Let's face it, a lot of the time it's about ego. Governments are filled with people, and people have too much pride to admit that they're wrong. One notable exception was in 1962, when French President Charles de Gaulle withdrew his forces from the Algerian War, understanding that France had lost the fight. But it's not just overseas that our governments have proven untrustworthy. The empty promises of political campaigns can easily convince voters to show support, but they're rarely delivered on. Politicians make promises they can't fulfill all the time. During his campaign in 1988, George H.W. Bush made the promise that he would never, ever, under any circumstances, raise taxes. And then in 1990, he admitted that fixing the economy would require tax increases. He made the promise of no new taxes, but failed to deliver. Was he lying? Probably, but that's because to make that kind of sweeping assertion is almost impossible to follow through on. But these are the kind of things that help candidates win. The other thing that can help candidates win is an environment of division. Politicians use our perceived division to stroke anger, fear, and passion. Right now we're seeing a global wave of distinct rhetoric from America to Argentina to Italy. But are we really that divided? The government and the media keep telling us that we are, but there might be a widening gap between our reality and what we're told. Members of the government might adopt extreme positions, but often average voters don't. Especially now, younger generations are resistant to supporting a political party. So is the future actually going to be as divided as many want us to think? It's easy to point fingers at the government or a large corporation for lying to us, but it gets harder when we talk about lies coming from people whose entire brands depend on helping others. But that certainly doesn't mean that lies aren't rampant throughout the self-help industry. They oversell personal empowerment, hyping up hope and creating a false sense of self-confidence among so many of us. You've probably heard the phrase toxic positivity. It's when we tell ourselves or listen to encouraging statements that are meant to minimize or eliminate painful emotions. This leads to pressure to be unrealistically optimistic without considering the reality of a situation. And the truth is that sadness, disappointment, and anger can all be pretty helpful emotions to experience. Positive thinking isn't necessarily bad, but if we believe that walking around thinking everything is great all the time is going to help us grow, we're probably kidding ourselves to some extent. Self-help guru Tony Robbins says that there's no such thing as failure, only results. This concept of there's no such thing as failure hits us on podcasts and books and social media posts, pushing us to ignore when we come up short. But why is failure framed as such a bad thing? Why do we have to rename or ignore it altogether? Can't failure just be failure, and can't it be okay to be disappointed when you experience it? A lot of self-help guides try to sell us on financial freedom as our ultimate goal, as if working is such a horrible thing. Of course, financial stress isn't pleasant, but why is being free of any sort of pressure to work such a desirable thing? The world has convinced us that we need to be living on passive income, enjoying every second of every day by the time we're 30. Success, financial or otherwise, takes time. And the journey, while difficult, doesn't have to be miserable. Don't let some online expert convince you that it will be. Often these goals or ways of viewing the world are set by gurus and experts, are an attempt to make us feel that who we are and what we have isn't enough. These days we're bred on a sense of inadequacy, always striving for something different. If we don't feel we're good enough, we'll buy products that promise to make us better, healthier, prettier, and happier. It all comes back to money. But the lies from the world are, frankly, nothing compared to the lies we tell ourselves. I have to be perfect. Maybe I'll never be happy, and if I could just fix that one thing, my life would be amazing, and if I could get married, find a better job, buy a new car, or floss every day. But no one single thing is the solution to happiness. If I ignore that bad feeling, it'll go away. I don't have a choice how I spend my time, and if I had more time, I would exercise, socialize, or learn to crochet. The truth is, either we want to do something or we don't. It might sound fun to become a piano player, but after spending 3 hours learning beginner chords, you might think otherwise. I can change other people. No, you can't. We can, if we're lucky, help them change themselves. However, we shouldn't sign up for that either. There's no point in lying to ourselves here. People are just who they are, including us, you and me. So no matter what your employer or your president is promising you, or what that famous podcast host or financial expert is trying to convince you of, you know who you are and you know what you need. And you can trust yourself to root out the lies, especially the ones buried deep inside.
In 2010, around 40,000 people died from drug overdoses in the United States. Quantifying the importance and meaning of individual human life in a single statistic is impossible. But that number might already seem high, especially if you knew one of those people. But it gets worse. So much worse. In 2021, more than 100,000 people died from drug overdose, and that number seems to continue to increase each year. Pinpointing an exact reason behind these rising numbers is complicated, but it all starts with these 5 words: fentanyl and the dark web. According to a UCLA study, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's 50 times stronger than heroin, was responsible for around 10% of drug overdose deaths in 2010. In 2015, the first spike of deaths as a result of fentanyl overdose happened. It remained localized in the eastern United States for several years until 2019, when it made its way across the country. Suddenly, everyone was exposed and death rates skyrocketed. As of 2021, a staggering 66% of drug overdoses were as a result of fentanyl, and that number keeps rising. Now you might say, what's the problem? If people take drugs, they should be willing to face the consequences, and while you may be right, the problem is that most people who are dying from fentanyl overdose aren't even aware they're consuming it. And it's all because of one group of people: the fentanyl kings of the dark web, criminal gangs who have figured out how to manufacture and distribute fentanyl illegally.
Because fentanyl is much cheaper to produce than other drugs, they've begun lacing it with those other drugs and selling them to unsuspecting users. This is the true cause of the fentanyl crisis. Between 2010 and 2021, the amount of drugs used didn't double, nor did the number of users. In fact, drug use hasn't increased very much, it's just become much more lethal. There is a solution, but it's a rather radical one that requires an open mind to even consider.
What if we controlled the supply itself instead of trying to control the suppliers? If you can't beat them, join them, if you will. It could be that the only way to truly protect people from tainted drugs is to start right at the source by controlling the supply itself and having it produced and distributed legally. The approach isn't all that crazy when you think about how the opioid crisis exploded. Gone are the days of drugs being distributed on street corners or from corrupt doctors. Many now come from a much more sinister place: the dark web. Drug buyers no longer need a back alley to sell drugs. People don't need to steal from pharmacies or doctors' offices to get pills. They can sit at their computer or on their phone and purchase their drug of choice and have it delivered to their home. Using special browsers and software that conceals your IP addresses, users are hard, if not almost impossible, to trace on the dark web. This makes it the perfect place for secret shops to sell illegal substances. Unsurprisingly, this poses a massive challenge for law enforcement, which is trying to crack down on the illegal drug trade. The dark web leads investigators and police on a never-ending game of whack-a-mole as they try and stamp out anonymous markets, only to see new ones pop up. One software called Tor routes user data through servers worldwide, disguising your IP address. This means that communications between the buyer and seller end up scrambled, for lack of a better term. Then you add crypto as a means of monetary exchange, and you can see why it's almost impossible to regulate our way out of this mess. All of this has helped fuel the fentanyl crisis. The dark web offers an accessible vehicle to buy drugs and opens up the sellers to a whole market that wasn't there before. The people who are curious but not about to commit a crime out in the open, now they can do it from their couch. Yes, the dark web has benefits. Whistleblowers who work in government or other industries can alert journalists to important facts without being identified. People in authoritarian regimes might use the dark web to avoid detection or having their internet tracked. But the same features that make the dark web appealing for people who are trying to stay safe lure in drug traffickers to avoid police surveillance. By now, the dark web is so global that even municipal police officers have to look globally to track down shipments and transactions of illegal drugs. And if one site gets shut down, another one inevitably will take its place. But before it even makes it onto the dark web, dealers have to decide to use it. Fentanyl doesn't end up in shipments of cocaine by mistake. So why lace it in there if the chance for fatality is so high? Some dealers think they can mitigate the risk by measuring fentanyl carefully. If done correctly, fentanyl can help create a stream of return customers because it's so addictive. This explains why it's so often found in cocaine or in counterfeit Xanax and Adderall. It's more addictive than those drugs themselves, so it keeps people coming back for more. Also, there's the capitalist argument. It's cheaper than the other opioids. A small fraction of fentanyl can mimic the high of larger doses of other opioids like heroin or painkillers. Dealers will use simple binding agents and a small amount of fentanyl when they make counterfeit opioid pills because it helps their bottom line. The potency of fentanyl also makes it a really easy drug to traffic. A formerly incarcerated dealer claimed that he could make over 10 times the amount of counterfeit pills when he used fentanyl instead of other drugs on their own. Even though fentanyl is heavily regulated in hospitals or other medical settings, it's not regulated at all on the internet, much less the dark web. So small mistakes by uneducated, malicious, or ignorant dealers can be fatal. The big question is, can we stop it? Of course, to do that, we need to know who the people behind these dark websites are, the operations. Just like the infamous drug lords like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo, there are kingpins running the dark web trade as well. It all started with a site called Silk Road, the first large-scale dark web drug market, which began in 2011. It received a lot of media attention, and eventually, law enforcement was able to step in and shut it down in 2013, but more sites took its place. Alpha Bay popped up and was shut down in 2017, but has recently been clawing its way back to the top. Dream Market was also a popular market until it was shuttered in 2019. Its inner workings can tell us a lot about how these sites function. Dream Market had around 100,000 listings and at the time was the biggest dark web shopping center for drugs.
More than half its listings were for illicit substances, although it also sold things like designer clothes, counterfeit money, and stolen online banking information. The shopping experience is similar to what most of us experience when we need a new yoga mat or that random piece that broke off your fridge. Buyers can go to any of these sites, search the inventory, and pay in crypto, and the drugs will arrive on their doorstep. And like the typical online shopping experience, buyers can leave reviews for vendors and products. Let's say you're buying a new TV. You might go online and read some reviews, look for the best deal, or see which retailers are the most reputable for what you're looking for. The worst case scenario is you might buy a shoddy TV. But on the dark web drug markets, the worst case scenario is you buy drugs that are laced with something like fentanyl that could kill you. The reviews might read like an old product on Amazon, but they are as consequential as it gets. One review on Dream Market of 100 milligrams of the drug carfentanil said, "It took forever to find a new carfent supplier, finally found a good vendor. It's great." It reads innocent enough, but carfentanil is a synthetic opioid used to sedate large animals that is even more potent than fentanyl. 100 milligrams is enough to kill dozens of people. With all the difficulty around taking down sites and kingpins that operate them, there have been some high-profile success stories in curbing the dark web drug market. A 40-year-old Indian-British man named Banmeet Singh ran an international drug ring from his home in the UK. He was charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering and to distribute and possess with intent to distribute controlled substances in April 2024. He admitted that from 2012 to 2017 he was active on the dark web drug market, distributing heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, ecstasy, LSD, ketamine, Xanax, and plenty of other drugs. He had to surrender more than 4,000 Bitcoin, which was valued at more than $245 million, and was given the same priority level of threat as El Chapo. Then there was Operation Spectre, an enforcement operation from the US Department of Justice that ended in May 2023 that was meant to target opioid and fentanyl trafficking on the dark web. The operation resulted in 288 arrests, the most ever for this type of operation, and the seizure of 117 firearms and 850 kilograms of drugs, which also included 64 kilograms of fentanyl or fentanyl-laced narcotics. On top of all that, they also seized $53 million in cash in crypto. This international effort spanned 3 continents to disrupt fentanyl and opioid trafficking, and was accompanied by a public awareness campaign to promote resources for those struggling with substance abuse. The operation's message to criminals on the dark web is, you can try and hide in the furthest reaches of the internet, but the Justice Department will find you and hold you accountable for your crimes. This only furthered the Drug Enforcement Agency's commitment to shutting down the fentanyl and opioid supply chain from beginning to end. They may be committed now, but the dark web keeps growing and growing, and inevitably another kingpin will pop up, and no matter how successful they've been in the past, authorities will just need to start over again. So is it more effective to try and shut it all down, or just control the supply instead? In the 1920s, the US banned alcohol, but people didn't stop drinking. They went underground, and illegal traffickers operated similarly to how those on the dark web operate now. Illegal activity increased, there was no regulation, and alcohol that was much stronger and more dangerous than what had previously been for sale became widely available. Are we in this era with the drug trade? And if so, is it time to rethink our approach? The goal is, by whatever means necessary, to save lives.
People simply empty out, their bodies with fearful and obedient minds. The color leaves the eye, the voice becomes ugly, and the body, the hair, the fingernails, the shoes, everything does. Does this sound familiar? A long day looking in front of the computer screen causes an aching feeling behind the eyes. Your legs turn to jelly after spending a long shift behind the cash register. Your skin becomes pale and gray with too much time under fluorescent warehouse lights. The 9-to-5 continues to diminish our morale and humanity. Why are we doomed to this unsustainable way of life? These were the same questions posed by writer Charles Bukowski in a famous letter to his friend John Martin. Born in Germany and raised in 1930s Los Angeles, Charles Bukowski faced a rough childhood marked by abuse, poverty, and bullying. His hardships fostered an early dependency on alcohol. Bukowski attempted to pursue a career in writing in New York after high school, but financial struggles forced his return to LA, where he reluctantly spent almost a decade as a postal clerk. His detest for the 9-to-5 lifestyle became a barrier to his creative aspirations. After his career with the Postal Service, Bukowski wrote an autobiographical novel about his working years aptly titled Post Office. Its publication launched his career, and he became a literary sensation at age 51. 15 years later, in his famous letter, Bukowski wrote of how 9-to-5 work empties the body and drains the worker of any essential life. It's hard to believe that the 8-hour working day came to be through activism. Between the late 1700s and mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution transformed the working world. Instead of working in the home and sustaining their family off of small trade loops within their community, people started selling their labor to companies. Let's use the textile industry as an example. Mechanization meant clothing was now a good to be bought and sold instead of made in the home, and laborers were required to work the factory floor. They would then use their work money to buy the required goods and services. Working outside the home for a company was a massive economic shift, and it resonates in the modern day. Income and population rose as this change significantly increased global living standards. But an average working day this time could range from 10 to 16 hours, and children were not exempt from the labor force. Rumblings of dissent reverberated among workers as fatigue, sickness, and injury were common in the workplace. So, in the early 19th century, activist Robert Owen proposed standardizing a 10-hour workday. By 1817, an even better proposal of an 8-hour workday gained popularity. Labor activists believed that 8 hours of the day should be dedicated to work, 8 hours to rest, and 8 hours to recreation. This revolution improved working conditions and also productivity. Foremen and managers realized that happy, healthy workers were more productive. But how much of your time off each day, or supposed recreation time, is used to prepare yourself for the next day? Does this tidy division of time work in reality? Your allotted 8 hours for recreation per day quickly dissolves when you add meal prep, commuting, laundry, housework, childcare, and errands into the mix. And at the end of all that, do you even have quality recreation time each day? You spend your evenings in front of the TV, doom scrolling, or playing video games, which is okay in moderation, but the demands of your work life and the activities that require you to be an optimal worker tire you out. You feel too drained to partake in hobbies or activities that would otherwise fulfill you. Also, with the dawn of smartphones and wireless file sharing, it's easy for your workday to extend into the night. You're expected to be on the clock, checking emails and finalizing presentations, even in your pajamas on the couch. Your work time bleeds over into your rest until you can't see where one role ends and the other begins. Worse, the extra time you've put in at home doesn't exempt you from clocking back in the following day at 9. Even the self-help movement disguises its motives to sneak its way into making you a better participant in capitalism. You're only creating a more productive worker by molding a better you. Things like atomic habits, overcoming supposed laziness, and manifestation promise to lead you to your professional goals while creating a happy, healthier you. Self-help gurus teach you how to do more with less instead of reassessing the root of why the system has left you broken. Writer and cultural critic Gia Tolentino takes this further in her essay, Always Be Optimizing. According to her, every aspect of modern life is geared towards creating a more efficient you. From workout crazes to salad bars, you never have a moment where you are off the clock in a world that strives to produce the best workers. If you're interested, I have a video about self-improvement where I talk about this further. But if you spend most of your life working or preparing to work for a job you resent or don't enjoy, how can you expect to be happy? Yes, it might be hard to get out of bed in the morning or find motivation, but for some, discontent in the workplace leads to violent outbursts. Ever wonder where the phrase "going postal" comes from? Well, in the late 80s and early 90s, there were a series of workplace shootings in US postal offices across America, killing at least 35 people. The gunmen associated with these murders are classified as workplace avengers. They were often middle-aged white men facing economic anxiety, obsolescence, or possible termination from their job. At the peak of their earning potential, they become resentful when they feel like they aren't making what they should be at work. Their co-workers become symbolic of their fury, which results in violent behavior. Often these homicides were caused by people diagnosed with mental illness or antisocial behavior. Most of the time, they were triggered by wanting to take revenge on a boss or the institution after a firing or reprimand. It's called murder by proxy, where you transfer the identity of your intended victim onto anyone slightly associated with it. The shooters wanted vengeance on their workplace, and their colleagues were, sadly, representative of that place. The Postal Service conducted an internal review to try and find the root cause of this discontent. Of course, there's not one specific reason that links all of these instances of workplace violence, but the nature of the work is a common denominator. There are many structural problems with the US Postal Service that are too tedious to get into here, but one of the findings revealed that rural postal workers are happier than urban ones.
Rural workers create their schedules and are in charge of how they carry out their work each day. If they get all the mail delivered by the end of the day, that's a job well done. Urban workers, however, negotiate their workload each day with managers. In urban centers, the postal service must squeeze the maximum of efficiency out of each worker. They'd rather hand out overtime and overrun the workers they have than hire more. And that one difference, choosing how you will complete your work for the day, is a determining factor of overall happiness at work. Work is whittled down to its most essential parts in industries with winnowing resources. When profit is king, there's no room to innovate your work structure to support workers better. Something happens when workers become starkly aware of their place as a cog in the machine. While most people don't retaliate against the system in a homicidal rage, we spend so much of our lives working that it has an evident influence on our emotional health. Busting your butt to keep a job that you might want is taxing. In this situation, you must maintain cognitive dissonance, or disassociation from yourself, for 40 hours a week. Because what's the alternative? To exist in modern society, you must generate an income. In his letter, Bukowski likened work to slavery for this reason. Unless you come from immense generational wealth or you're at peace with a monkish existence, work is inevitable. Work that is isolating and repetitive, like in a warehouse or factory, causes your mind to wander, and without proper outlets, you can foster pent-up rage. Your body becomes like a machine, repeatedly fulfilling the same task, an instrument to generate money. Your work denies you your humanity, yet you're doomed to live most of your life in this state. How can most people genuinely claim that they're happy with this system? The vast majority of us won't be as lucky as Charles Bukowski. Bukowski got a ticket out of his grueling manual labor job. Remember John Martin, the friend to whom Bukowski wrote his letter outlining his problems with the 9-to-5? Well, in 1969, Martin offered to pay Bukowski to quit his job at the Postal Service and commit himself full-time to writing. At the time, Bukowski wrote, "I have one of two choices: stay in the post office and go crazy, or stay out here and play at writer and starve. And I've decided to starve." Within his first month as a full-time writer, he finished his debut novel. Martin owned a small press, and as a token of gratitude, Bukowski published with him throughout his illustrious career. But how rare is that? Imagine someone approaches you and offers to fund your passion project for the rest of your life. You would probably quit your day job on the spot. Such an opportunity won't arise for most people. So how do we find a way to cope with this unfulfilling work structure? You can't really opt out, but is there a way to lessen the burden of your 9-to-5? One thing you can do is say no to work when you can. Maintaining a proper work-life balance is crucial to overall health and happiness, but setting those boundaries takes practice. You have to know your worth as a worker and be willing to stand up for yourself. You must take your entitled lunch and break times and refuse to work after your contracted hours without any overtime pay. While Bukowski was cynical about the sanctity of your free time during your workday, you are entitled to it as a worker. And the more workers unite to enforce these rights properly, the less likely employers will abuse them. Hence the importance of unions. If you're a union member, ensure you're fully informed about what your union can do for you. Participate in union votes and strikes and make sure your voice is heard. It's one of the only ways to push change forward in the workplace. Some companies have taken the initiative to change their structure, and after all, our world looks a lot different than it did during the Industrial Revolution. The 40-hour workweek now seems absurd. Shorter, less demanding work weeks prove this arbitrary time designation is obsolete. In an experiment, companies in New Zealand dropped to a 4-day work week, which resulted in greater workplace happiness without sacrificing that much productivity. Also, working from home, if your industry allows, frees up commuting time and enables you to sneak in some housework between meetings. Workers feel most empowered when they have some say over how their day is spent. Companies that allow their employees to make themselves as happy as possible during the work week help pave the way for a better work-life balance. It is also essential to reclaim your free time, and free time means just that. Moments that you deliberately dedicate to absolutely nothing. Nothing in this context entails anything where you aren't making or spending money. Walking, picnics with friends, reading a book, even just staring off into space. Those alone moments allow you to cultivate a sense of self outside of work. It's unhealthy to lead your life with a sense of doom, but escaping the doom loop is difficult. Your time is precious and sacred, and the time you spend not working is even more so. Use it to reclaim your humanity and remind yourself you weren't put on earth to work. You are here to live the best life you can. then you owe it to yourself to create the best life for yourself, regardless of the constraints of the 9 to 5.
You've just graduated college and worked your first month at your new job. You've worked extremely hard to get this position, and getting that first paycheck feels like such a triumphant moment. The possibilities of what you can do with your income are exciting. This is the first time you've had a sense of freedom over the money you've earned, but the sad truth is, you don't have any freedom, and that reality becomes clear when you open a letter you receive in the mail a few days later. It's from a student loan program informing you of your repayment schedule. This paycheck never really was yours. You owe money, you're in debt, and will be in debt for a very long time. And once the realization sets in, every coffee purchased or drink with a friend suddenly starts to feel like you're splurging with someone else's money. It makes you feel guilty and sometimes even depressed. This is the story of around 1 in 5 American adults who have student loan debt, but in reality, this isn't your fault. It's just one of the ways that governments and banks might be keeping you poor. The truth is, debt can lead you down a pretty dark road, especially if you're not concerned about falling deeper into it. Household debt in the US just hit a record high of $16.9 trillion. That's 16 with 15 zeros behind it. Even making 6 figures, you're more likely to be living paycheck to paycheck than thriving. College-educated people with high-paying jobs are struggling to cover basic rent and car payments. Add with the losses on 401ks and investment accounts, and you can see why money managers are adjusting how they protect and grow their clients' wealth. Before continuing, I should clarify that not all debt is bad. It can give people opportunities that they might not have had otherwise. It allows startups to get off the ground without using personal capital, and it allows people to make big purchases that can be paid off in smaller chunks spread over a long period of time. But too much debt and lousy interest rates can cause severe problems. Studies suggest that being in debt can make you more anxious, depressed, and cause many people to experience suicidal thoughts. You might feel okay with how much you owe right now, but these mental health issues can grow bigger as your debt gets higher. Debt also makes your future feel limited. Your ability to travel, make big purchases, and move on to another phase of life is greatly challenged by the amount of money you owe. For instance, you can't get a mortgage if you have too much student debt. Debt can impact your relationships and health, and there are studies linking bad debt ratios to high blood pressure and higher rates of divorce. It goes back to that feeling of splurging on something using someone else's money. This feeling puts a spotlight on spending habits within a relationship, causing stress, arguments, and separation. You don't need to be a gambling addict to have fights over money. You might think it's okay to incur debt because when you die, it dies with you, but this isn't always the truth. A lot of different debts can be inherited by your loved ones, especially debts you've taken on with another person, like mortgage. Being in debt isn't great, but don't be too hard on yourself because it's not necessarily your fault. We live in a society that has institutionalized debt and has made borrowing a living commonplace. Think about it, we're encouraging young kids barely old enough to vote to take on thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans just to get an education. We all know how terrible these loans can be, but one effect we don't really talk about is how they tend to normalize the idea of taking on debt to people who are just entering adulthood. This creates a mindset about money that takes a very long time to shake, even if it's possible to shake at all. A student who has a lot of loans to repay may also experience debt fatalism, a state where being in debt seems inescapable. If you're accustomed to existing in debt, it's difficult to picture what it's like to exist without it, and as a result, you're more likely to continue drowning in it. When people think of debt, there's often the stigma that it's the individual's fault. You hear finance gurus tell you about wasteful people who splurge on the latest iPhone and buy Starbucks every day instead of making coffee at home. And while there are certainly people who are responsible with credit, the reality is that most people who are in debt are there out of necessity. For one, people with children are far more likely to incur debt from the cost of taking care of a child. The same goes for people who have to take care of a parent. These two factors introduce a variety of necessary expenses that no amount of penny pitching will mitigate. Most people's financial literacy is also very poor. It's a subject that's seldom taught in schools, so we're often at the mercy of the lenders and the fine print that we don't bother to read. Even if we did take the time to read the terms and conditions while applying for a new credit card, would we even understand them? All of this without even talking about the system whose entire existence depends on debt: banks. Let's take a moment to look at how banks work. You give them money, 90% of that money is lent to someone else. The person taking the loan puts it in their account, and 90% of that amount is loaned to someone else, and so on. The bank charges interest on all those loans that were made possible thanks to your money. Debt is how they make money. It's the core of their business model. To make matters worse, banks are profit-driven and often use predatory practices to try and get you to incur more debt because their favorite clients aren't the ones who pay off their debt as quickly as possible, but the ones they refer to as revolvers, people who are perpetually in debt. Banks know your income and they know what you can't afford, but that doesn't seem to stop them from issuing you multiple credit cards or locking you into a high-interest loan. These are companies that pursue profits over the well-being of their clients. Imagine having several maxed-out credit cards and then piling on multiple high-interest loans until you can no longer afford the minimum payment on any of them. Where else can you go? Remember that dark road we talked about earlier? Well, that road can lead to someone taking their own life. This is what's known as debt suicide. People find themselves drowning in debt and feel like there's no other way to escape it. People in debt are 3 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and similarly, people who die from suicide are 8 times more likely to be in debt. Sure, you can say that ultimately the individual is responsible, but what about the corporations that nudge, push, and deceive these people into making poor financial decisions? What responsibility should they bear in all of this? Credit card companies, for example, will often use deceitful tactics like charging 0% interest for the first 6 months to try and get people accustomed to not paying off their credit cards. Then, when the high interest kicks in, there's a good chance the cardholder has already accumulated a ton of debt. Strategies like this are designed to nudge more and more people down the dark path, keeping them poor. It's how banks and credit card companies make more money. It's in the pursuit of bigger profits. They knowingly neglect the welfare of their clients. This can sometimes mean that the parents can afford to give their kids a decent start to life, or that the kids can afford to give their parents a decent end to life. These are the real consequences. We're destroying the lives of the common people to fill the pockets of the few at the top. These shady companies are on one side of the institutional debt equation. On the other side is what we need all that loan money for in the first place. The 2 biggest expenses in life of an average person in the US are an education and a home. And in the last 50 years, the cost of both have skyrocketed, far outpacing inflation. To what many would consider a good life with a home they own and a good education, most people either have to come from wealth or incur enormous debt. But why has college and university tuition risen so much? A main culprit in the US is the reduction of state funding for these schools. For the last 30 years, colleges have been a primary target for governments to cut costs, especially during recessions. This reduction has caused colleges to operate more like businesses to earn the money they need to stay afloat. But the unintended consequences of schools operating like businesses is that they are now more focused on competing aggressively with each other and trying to make the most profits, instead of focusing on the welfare of the students. This means that pursuing star professors and researchers with higher wages, keeping class sizes lower to be more attractive to potential applicants, and introducing a lot more extracurriculars to attract students, even though they might be an unnecessary expense that only increases tuitions further. There's no central mechanism in the United States to control the cost of higher education. The country does give students a fair amount of financial aid, but much of the country's college tuition is paid for through loan programs. In neighboring Canada, tuition has also risen a lot in the same period, even though it's more significantly subsidized for citizens. The problem remains that students across North America are paying a lot more for post-secondary education than they were before, and it's happening on the government's watch. But there's a much bigger cause of debt that has also exploded in cost in the last 30 years. Housing. The reason why housing is so expensive now is complicated. I'd love to write it off as greed, but that wouldn't be telling the full story. One of the main causes of housing's high cost is government regulation, but it's not quite what you think. Regulations are important. There's environmental impact analysis, soil sampling, and numerous other approvals that need to be acquired before a developer can break new ground. These are necessary but expensive steps that need to be taken today that wouldn't have been done 30 or more years ago, and it's great that we're doing them now. But there are other unnecessary regulations that aren't driven by human and environmental needs. These are housing density regulations, and they have a big impact on house prices. Housing exists in a system of supply and demand. More supply typically results in lower cost. A great way to increase the housing supply is to build higher density housing, like apartment buildings, but in many cities and towns across North America, regulations are preventing higher density housing from being built. And these regulations are often influenced by current homeowners who want their homes to remain at sky-high value. When high-density condominium buildings do get built in great numbers, there are still some other factors that can prevent home prices from falling. In Toronto, for example, developers build large luxury condos, ones that sell at a premium price. These condos wouldn't sell very well at those prices if not for a second factor that's keeping prices high: investment homes. These are homes that wealthy people buy up as investments, reducing the local supply and therefore increasing the value of these homes. Many luxury condos are purchased as investments only, leaving many of them sitting empty, even during a housing crisis. Governments have done little to intervene in investment housing and have instead prohibited solutions like higher density housing. Blame is often passed between levels of government, with local, state, provincial, and federal bodies blaming each other and kicking the can further down the road. And the result is that home ownership becomes an enormous source of debt for some people and not even a remote possibility for others. And there's no escape from this problem by simply renting either. The cost of rent has also skyrocketed as a consequence of higher housing prices, further leading into even more debt. Another problem for renters is when the companies buy existing buildings, give them a luxury renovation, and then jack up the price of rent. No new homes are built in this scenario, and the average price of a home and rent still goes up. The question of personal responsibility for debt doesn't seem so significant when you see how banks and governments are making increasingly larger debt loads inescapable. Debt is painful, and it seems like our largest institutions are too invested in profiting from it to make it easier on the average person. For now, we can make sure to not take on unnecessary debts and be sure to read the fine print when we do need to take out a loan. The truth is that governments can do a whole lot more to help their poorest citizens. The video on screen right now will show you how the richest man who ever lived did exactly that for his citizens. Are you depressed, in need of fulfillment? Do you feel like life is passing you by, like you're watching all your friends move forward, climbing the ladder of success, and accomplish the huge things that you wish you could? We've all felt like this at some point, and that feeling is that we can't get control of our lives. It's universal, but that doesn't make it any less painful. Then one day, you see a book. It boasts that the secrets to success, happiness, and personal growth are all inside. Do you buy it? Because I know I would, and I have, time and time again, flipping through those pages excitedly only to return to my unfulfilled state once no more pages are left. Millions of us are drawn to the world of self-help because we're looking for answers. But does this endless stream of advice, speeches, seminars, and products actually help us, or is self-help ruining our lives? In the 18th and 19th centuries, US and European entrepreneurs marketed and sold snake oil as a cure-all drug. In reality, though, all they were selling was mineral oil, sometimes mixed with household herbs and spices that contained no snake-derived ingredients whatsoever, and would in fact not cure any diseases. Today, a snake oil salesperson describes someone who advertises or sells any product that promises the world and fails to deliver. Sadly, that's the story of self-improvement, at least as it is today. Because while it might seem like a new trend, the idea of self-help dates back to early philosophers like Seneca and Socrates. In 5th century BC, Socrates spoke about the constant improvement of your soul. He insisted that practices like meditation, fasting, prayer, and exercise could feed your soul and therefore improve your life. Plato, Epicurus, and Pythagoras followed in his footsteps, professing that working on yourself is a path to enlightenment. Hundreds of years later, in the 1970s, the New Age movement arose and preached a philosophy of personal transformation and healing. The movement revolved around accessing our spiritual energy through yoga, meditation, tarot card readings, and astrology. This idea that we could elevate ourselves and all of humanity has persisted, but like most things in the West, once people found out just how much money they could make, self-improvement shifted from being a guide for those who needed it the most to a product reserved for those who could afford it. Deepak Chopra, a prominent figure in the New Age movement, has emerged as one of the most critical self-help gurus in the world. His philosophy tells us that our mental health can determine our physical reality, that we can think ourselves into being healthier and happier. After his ideas were popularized by none other than Oprah Winfrey, Chopra became an international sensation. He used his platform to spread his message and sell his books. He's written 49 in total. He held seminars and became a spiritual advisor to celebrities like Michael Jackson. Needless to say, lost souls worldwide have made Chopra a very wealthy man. Tony Robbins, one of the most popular and controversial self-help figures, runs a multi-billion-dollar business. Exclusive membership to his program can cost as much as $85,000 a year. And although he's been wrapped up in accusations of harassment and hostility and is notorious for requiring his employees to sign NDAs, he still manages to sell out auditoriums for his speaking engagements. One of the biggest problems with self-help is that, just like snake oil salespersons, self-help experts claim to be able to heal the world with their speech. In reality, whether you're Chopra or Robbins, or one of the hundreds of other experts, you can never be a therapist for everyone.
Personal mental health professionals like licensed therapists, psychologists, and psychiatrists listen to individuals and understand their needs and offer unique solutions, whereas self-help gurus use their personal stories to convince followers that they have all the answers without recognizing the nuance of each individual situation. Not only are these gurus convincing us that their solutions are a one-size-fits-all, but a vast majority of them don't even have the qualifications to be discussing mental health in the first place. We can all agree that what causes us stress, pain, or depression isn't the same for everyone, and the way stress shows itself is different too. Some of us might spend days on the sofa watching reruns of Friends, while others might go out partying every night. We can't judge or offer solutions without engaging with each person individually and trying to understand their motives. Self-help gurus peddle magic solutions to make you, their audience, believe they have some elusive secret that you won't find without them. This is how they turned it into a $13 billion industry littered with books, speaking events, and mentorship programs. But these books and events rarely address the actual issues in your life. They promise easy fixes that are nice to hear, but often fall short of helping you develop actionable ways to help yourself. One study, which reviewed over 100 cases, found that self-help treatment plans are hard to follow and easy to misinterpret. And frankly, this is what the industry wants, because if you could actually help yourself, who would buy their books or attend their coaching sessions? The goal of this endless stream of books and speeches isn't healing, it's to make you feel good for a moment, but eventually to feel miserable again, so you can pick up the next book. If this isn't the case, explain why you need 49 books written by the same person to teach you how to help yourself. Many self-help gurus do more than just write books. They have speaking engagements, YouTube channels, paid newsletters, and personal coaching sessions. The harsh reality is that you're ultimately more valuable to them when you're unhappy and discontent, so why would they teach you how to help yourself? The endless cycle of self-help content triggers the dopamine system in our brain, which is the same system that regulates or succumbs to addiction. When we read a chapter of a self-help book, we get a flood of dopamine and feel motivated to take on life's challenges, but when that dopamine wears off, we're left craving more. And we turn back to where we got it from, the self-help content. That's why we feel a strange combination of excitement and inadequacy after watching a TED Talk about living a more fulfilling life. In reality, people who consume self-help books have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol and are more likely to have symptoms of depression. When we're in the moment, our brain tricks us into thinking we've accomplished something when in reality we've done nothing to move ourselves forward. The world of self-help comes in all shapes and sizes. Some gurus focus on helping your career, others on your spiritual enlightenment. But they all have one thing in common: they all claim to have the secret to turning you into your best self. Recently, one of the running themes has been hustle culture, and it's the idea that if you work like hell, put in an 80-hour work week, and are productive every second of every day, you'll achieve career success. But anyone who's actually attempted an 80-hour work week or tried to survive on 4 hours of sleep a night in the name of productivity can tell you that the hustle is opposite of glamorous. Yeah, you might make some money, but you've worked so hard that you have no time to enjoy it with family and friends. You work so hard and push yourself so far that you burn out. Soon negativity sits in, and now you feel worse than before. What do? Do you listen to your body and rest, or do you pick up a book and hit play on a podcast about happiness, fulfillment, and positivity? They tell you that your negative emotions aren't real, and that if you just focus on the good things in life, you'll get through it. This is toxic positivity, an attempt to dismiss negative emotions and respond to distressing situations with false reassurance.
There's no war in Ba Sing Se.
You may have heard the catchy phrases like "no bad days" or "everything happens for a reason," which are meant to make us dismiss any notion that our lives aren't amazing. Toxic positivity can ultimately come across as if we lack empathy towards ourselves and others, and that we ignore important decisions and emotions instead of accepting them. Because the truth is, avoiding our negative emotions only makes us feel worse later. If maximizing productivity and positivity isn't the brand of self-empowerment you're seeking, you might turn to guidance on self-care. The idea of self-care started in the 1980s when the black feminist writer and activist Audre Lorde proclaimed it as a political act. Sadly, it has since been co-opted and thoroughly misused by the internet. Over the past 5 years, searches for self-care have nearly tripled. Almost 70 billion Instagram posts include self-care, and on TikTok, hashtag self-care has racked up over 30 billion views. Whether the advice comes from a wellness guru like Gwyneth Paltrow or from a 22-year-old influencer, self-care can go too far. This self-help practice, like toxic positivity, can pull us away from the reality of our lives, and often it's a reality that we need to deal with. Self-care and hustle culture are on a collision course in one specific area of the self-help world: multi-level marketing companies. MLMs are popular and controversial businesses that sell products through a network of non-salaried salespeople who get commissions from the many other people they recruit to the job. MLMs claim to empower their workforce and help them find meaning in their lives. If you work for an MLM, you're not just selling their product, but the lifestyle that's tied to it. The head of the company becomes a guru, a motivational speaker with an inspirational backstory that you can connect to. And like most other self-help companies, MLMs have conventions, seminars, robust Facebook groups, and even books written by their founders, all meant to convince you that you'll be happy and healthy with their magical product. And if you bring 3 people who bring 3 people, you will be wealthy. MLMs have proven even more insidious than the typical self-help companies because they convince their distributors that their fortunes are just around the corner. The unsuspecting victims then invest so much of their money into these snake oil products only to end up with an overflow of items they can't sell, financial debt, or even worse, anxiety and depression. And the problem is more widespread than you think. 1 in 4 Americans report that their social media feeds have been hijacked by MLMs. This proliferation of social media has taken the warning signs of self-help into a new territory. The gurus are no longer household names like Chopper and Robbins. Now, thousands of influencers are self-proclaimed gurus offering mental and physical health advice through short captions and images that are never enough to unpack deep psychological understanding. And since many of us spend too much time scrolling on our phones, we're so busy consuming content about self-help that we don't actually do anything with the information. Instead, we overanalyze ourselves and end up convinced that there's something deeply wrong with us that we'll never be able to dig ourselves out of. The enlightened, happy person we always hope to be might be unreachable. The truth is, not all self-help is bad, and the key to it, like anything in life, is balance. Sometimes watching a motivational video or reading a chapter of a self-help book can give us the boost we need to perform that real-life action. The key is knowing how to sort out the helpful content from the cheap money-making schemes. Look for content that doesn't oversell a mission statement and applies a clear, practical approach to self-help. An example is the very popular book Atomic Habits by James Clear, which offers specific adjustments that we can all make to form better habits. Of course, the trick here is that once you read it, you need to make those adjustments in your daily life. Because self-help is never about the words you hear someone else say, but about the actions you can convince yourself to take. The key to a good life isn't hidden in some book or a $3,000 seminar. In fact, everything you need to know about living a good life can be written on a post-it note. Work hard, eat healthy, exercise, and focus on building healthy relationships. Sadly, post-it notes don't turn into multi-million-dollar book deals.
A couple of weeks ago, I was having dinner with a friend and overheard what had to be a first date at the table right next to us. The conversation was awkward at first as they both seemed to struggle to get a good flow going. I looked over a bit later to see that they were now much more engaged in discussion. They shared their interests and had started looking each other in the eye more often. They even touched hands. Slowly, the pair of them seemed to grow affectionate towards each other. I went to the bathroom and the guy on the date walked in and used the urinal next to me. And to my greatest shock, right there on his phone was an open dating app. With his less busy hand, he was swiping left and right. Back at the table, he ended the date abruptly and called it a night. Just like that, he was moving on to the next option available to him at just the click of a button. Maybe I'm a bit out of touch, but what I witnessed seemed so cruel and callous that I asked myself, is that what dating is like now? Where we just swipe human beings left or right, discarding and approving potential mates on our quest to lasting romance, a one-night stand, or something in between. Let's get one thing out of the way first. Dating sucks and has always sucked. Every date you go on, whether from an app or a more natural arrangement, you set yourself up for the strong likelihood of being disappointed or disappointing someone else. You might get your heart broken when your love is unrequited, or have to tear someone's heart out when you're just not feeling it. You might say the wrong thing, or your date might not even show up. These worries are the same now as they have been since romantic love became a thing in the 19th century. There's less emphasis on men needing to pick up their date in a hot rod and buy them dinner and drinks. And of course, gay and lesbian dates are more common, but otherwise, many of the worries are the same. Sadly, though, there is something distinctly different and more sinister about the world of online dating. You may need to be older to remember, but online dating first became a thing in the mid-90s and was heavily stigmatized at the time. Using Match.com or Kiss.com was for people who couldn't handle the real world of dating. Culturally, it was seen as a sign of weakness. Just like everything else that came with the internet, online dating grew and the potential dangers grew with it. Meeting a stranger, especially alone, poses a risk. Dating apps pose a slightly aggravated risk because they tend to attract an outsized portion of psychopaths and love addicts, with one seeing you as a victim and the other as their savior. That's not to suggest that you'll end up at the bottom of a river if you go on a few online dates, but that, at the very least, you might have had a really bad experience or two. When services like eHarmony arrived, they made a stronger case for computer-based matching using more detailed information. The services required you to take a quiz and would then try to pair people up based on their compatibility. Then in 2012, everything changed when Tinder arrived on the scene. The premise was simple. Once you opened the app, you were greeted with a multitude of options for a potential mate. A huge picture and a tiny description about them stared you right in the face. All you had to do was swipe right if you were interested and left if you weren't. If two people swiped right on each other, bingo, they matched and they could start a conversation. Even with just this basic understanding of how dating apps work, it shows how much we've managed to turn people into a commodity. This swiping feature isn't much different than flipping through products on a carousel ad you might see on Facebook or Instagram, or sifting through the different brand names in the grocery store. Right, left, is this really how we want to be viewed by others? Think about it, you're looking for someone to be intimate and vulnerable with, and we're presenting ourselves like a flavor of chips on a shelf. Realistically, how much can you expect from a relationship that starts out almost transactionally? The state of modern dating is the consequence of the system that we've created. Dating on these apps is now ruthless, with ghosting, no-shows, and hostile and inappropriate messaging being much more common. Meeting up with someone on a dating app is no different than trying to buy or sell something on Kijiji. If one of the parties loses interest, they typically just don't show up. No message, no courtesy call, they just move on. This is bad enough when you're trying to just buy a product, but much worse when the product is your time, attention, and emotions. When an app treats people like products on a shelf, this attitude rubs off on its users. You're not swiping right on a human being, you're swiping on a product, and if that product doesn't seem desirable anymore, you discard it. And these are the factors of dating apps before we've even considered how their algorithms factor in. Although Tinder insists it doesn't use this system anymore, many of the card-based dating apps use a desirability score, or ELO. The more you match with people you swipe right on, the more desirable you're considered. The app then pushes your profile to more people. This process has little to do with making a match. The goal is to keep people on the platform by dangling desirable individuals in front of them. The more attractive people you see, the more likely you are to feel hope that the one is out there and you won't delete the app. It's similar to how lotteries lure you in with bigger jackpots. Even though the odds are still next to impossible, the increasing pile of money keeps you hopeful when despair is the more appropriate response. When someone ranks higher, it doesn't make them more likely to be good in a relationship, it just means that people found them attractive based on the superficial criteria. Putting more of these people in your set of cards does nothing to increase your odds of finding love, it just increases the odds of you staying on the platform. Those with lower scores are shown less often, which gives them two options: give up, or pay to have their profile boosted. This common feature among the apps exploits people who don't present well for profit. Being able to boost your profile just gets you back to a more level playing field that you shouldn't have been denied in the first place. Remember that these platforms are, above all else, money-making systems. As we discussed in our recent video on algorithms, the bias towards profit has consequences, and in the case of dating apps, those consequences may be the dire state of the dating landscape or your chances for lasting love. Maybe the most disastrous thing about dating apps is that we're ultimately commodifying love, and that can change the way we view and experience it. When we're attracted to someone, our brain releases the chemical dopamine as a reward response. Online dating apps train us to constantly seek this dopamine hit from attraction or lust. Then when we're with someone, we're no longer getting that high of attraction. We know it can easily be found on an app in our pocket. All we have to do is ghost, deceive, or abruptly break up with someone in order to get it again. Even just looking at an attractive person on your app will give you a hit of dopamine, making loyalty to a lover much less appealing. You get hooked into a reward cycle, it becomes addictive. Just as you get a blip of joy from a like on social media, you get a hit of dopamine from a match on Tinder. It keeps you coming back even if you've found someone worth keeping. Most of us have been with someone we loved and still question whether there was someone better out there. Apps like Tinder exploit this feeling. They overwhelm you with choice, making you feel like you're never making the right one. And so you move on, back to the phone, back to the dopamine hits so readily available. As you go on dates and start relationships, the app is always dangling that shinier object or human being right in front of you. Because it's so fast and easy to get a new shot of dopamine by simply opening the app on our phones, we don't give ourselves enough time to get to know a person. Once a date gets even slightly boring, we're off to the bathroom to find the next dopamine hit. The problem with this is that although we're spiking our brains full of dopamine, we aren't spending enough time in relationships for our brains to produce oxytocin, or those warm, cuddly feelings which are more common in long-term relationships or with close friends and family. Oxytocin helps reduce our blood pressure and cortisol levels, which help reduce stress. It also promotes growth and healing. If you've ever been in a long-term loving relationship, you know just how at peace you feel. How when you're with this person, everything feels alright with the world. Dating apps are weaning us off of this feeling. Now, if those were the only problems with dating apps, then maybe the situation wouldn't be so dire, but sadly, there's more. Like most online interactions, dating apps are often devoid of the empathy and consideration you typically get in real-world interactions. Sure, there are bad experiences to be had at your workplace or school, and occasionally, someone will behave callously towards you in person, but these bad experiences are far more prevalent online, where people can hide behind their computer screens. The odd thing about this, though, is that even with all of their issues, dating apps seem to work. People do find long-lasting relationships on these platforms, and of course, people looking for hookups find that too. Meeting people in real life is hard, maybe harder these days than ever before. When you meet someone in real life and want to ask them on a date, you're taking a big risk, and we're all hyper aware of that risk. Well, most of us. If you ask a colleague or a peer on a date, for example, you're more likely to face some level of scrutiny now, even if it's small. And if you ask for someone's number in a grocery store, well, maybe you become the weirdo people complain about on Twitter. Considering this, it's not hard to see why people want anonymity in their dating life. Still, these dating apps don't need to be set up algorithmically to encourage cruelty or gouge less desirable people for money. Instead, we should empathize getting to know someone before a date and caring about them as human beings first, not just another item for sale at the nearby big box store. To do that, though, we need to crack open the black box and fundamentally change how the algorithms that power these dating apps work. Click the video on your screen right now to find out more.
Almost half of the world's population uses one of Meta's services every month. Facebook and Instagram combined hold over 75% of the social media market share, and WhatsApp has become the world's default instant messaging app. This is the story of how Facebook took over the world. In the early days of Facebook, it was reported that Zuckerberg ended meetings by shouting "domination," and it's safe to say that he's achieved it. To understand how, we need to rewind nearly 20 years.
Remember that old New Yorker cartoon? On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But in the real world, some of the internet's most influential and successful forces have their own version of that line. On the internet, nobody knows you're a teenager.
It's 2005, you're in high school, or starting your last year of college, or maybe you're a young parent trying to stay in touch with friends when you hear about a new website called Facebook, or maybe you're just 5 years old. So, you sign up. At the time, you had no idea you were looking at a website that would change the world as we know it. Facebook, of course, didn't invent social networking. It started in 1997 with 6degrees.com, the first website to feature profiles, friends, and location services. Then in 1999, LiveJournal came onto the scene as a way to keep in touch with friends via blogging. By 2007, it had 14 million users and was sold to a large Russian media company. Then there was Friendster in 2002 and MySpace in 2003. By 2005, MySpace was the dominant social network in the United States. But MySpace, or any of us, didn't have any idea what was coming. In one of Harvard's dorm rooms was young Mark Zuckerberg, working on a social networking site that would soon overthrow every competitor in the market. One working in Facebook's favor was timing. Thanks to the rising availability of broadband, more people were on the internet in the mid-2000s than ever before, and these previous social networks helped Facebook compile a long list of technical and business mistakes to avoid. But it certainly wasn't all luck. Zuckerberg and his co-founders built Facebook in a controlled, methodical way. It started at Harvard, then slowly expanded to other universities, high schools, and corporations. It wasn't until September of 2006, after 2 years of limited availability, that Facebook opened its platform to anyone 13 and over. This slow growth allowed time to perfect the technology and allowed its founders to hire intelligent engineers who constantly added new features. Facebook quickly gained around 12 million users, and by 2008, just 2 years after its public release, 100 million people were using Facebook. That same year, Sheryl Sandberg joined the company as Chief Operating Officer after working as the Chief of Staff for the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration. Sandberg was viewed as the adult in the room with Zuckerberg, and from there, things really took off. By December 2009, Facebook had become the most popular social platform in the world. When the movie The Social Network came out in 2010, Facebook's supremacy was officially solidified in Hollywood history. But that wasn't enough for Zuckerberg, who was looking for domination. Much of Facebook's success is thanks to its unique growth team. The company isn't just worried about getting new people to join, but is concerned with monthly active users, which indicates how often people return to the site and spend time on it. It might seem obvious these days, but in 2007, when Zuckerberg was just 23, he created a growth team that used data to generate engagement. At the time, other companies largely considered growth to be the responsibility of the PR and marketing departments, whereas Facebook prioritized data and engineering. In the early days, people left the site because they couldn't find their friends fast enough, so the growth team created the People You May Know function that allowed Facebook to access your contacts to suggest friends immediately. As you might expect, this led to some privacy issues like psychologist patients being recommended to befriend each other. This certainly wouldn't be Facebook's last dance with privacy concerns either. And that wasn't the only tool in the growth team's arsenal that came with controversy. Tristan Harris, a computer scientist and former Google employee, co-founded the Center for Humane Technology to push back against the addictive elements of technology. All tech companies, Facebook included, have relied on people's weaknesses and addictive tendencies to gain time and attention. The perfect example is the now ubiquitous like button. This kept people returning to the site for the dopamine hit they'd feel when someone liked their post. As Harris put it, the like button and everything that came with it essentially turned our smartphones into slot machines. And that's what the company wanted, because the more addictive the platform is to its users, the more opportunity for revenue because, well, ads. Facebook's advertising model didn't start off how we know it today. In the early college campus days, the site sold what it called flyers, which were ads students could buy to promote parties and other campus activities. As the company grew, businesses flocked to Facebook to advertise because they were able to directly target audiences by college, degree type, preferred courses, age, gender, and interests. This made Facebook's advertising far more effective than traditional print or TV advertising. By the end of 2007, 100,000 companies had signed up with Facebook's businesses pages, promoting themselves through advertising. Like Google Ads, Facebook's advertising strategy focused on reinventing the wheel altogether by linking ads to specific and targeted users. This idea seems so normal to us now when we merely talk about a toaster oven and suddenly it appears on our Instagram feed. But it was revolutionary then and continues to be insanely profitable for Facebook. But some might argue that the ultimate key to Facebook's status as a global behemoth is its consistent acquisition of companies it sees as competitors or additions to its master plan, aptly called the copy, acquire, kill method. It started in 2012 when Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion, and 2 years later it grabbed the global messaging app WhatsApp for $19 billion and virtual reality company Oculus for $2 billion. When companies like Snapchat wouldn't sell to them, Facebook simply copied and integrated the app's features into their own app. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's the same thing they're trying to do to Twitter by introducing Threads. Or is it X now? Facebook's rise has been meteoric, but it came with a rocky and bumpy ride. The first sign of danger for Facebook came in 2013, when its content moderation strategy, or lack thereof, unraveled. It was found to be experimenting with its users by showing certain content to influence people's moods. Eventually, it issued an apology, but that was small potatoes compared to what would come. The idea of fake news didn't really exist before 2015, but at the start of the 2016 US election, when a study found that 63% of Americans on Facebook got their news from Facebook, the company knew it had to get ahead of the potential for misinformation. It introduced a new feature that allowed users to flag articles as false news and rolled out a program for journalists to try and favor hard-hitting journalists. Sadly, these measures did next to nothing to stop the spread of misinformation. In the 2016 election, more people engaged with fake news stories than real ones, and it was all because of the way the algorithm was designed. Fake news is sensational and it's purposely designed to cause outrage and fear. But this also means it's more likely to be clicked on and commented on, prioritizing the story because the algorithm looks for and shares the articles that get the most interaction. Publicly, Zuckerberg insisted that Facebook wasn't an influence in the election, but behind the scenes, it provided Congress with information that proved a Russian-based organization had run 3,000 ads between 2015 and 2016 in possible connection with election interference. The ads, covering topics from race to gun rights, reached 10 million US citizens. Facebook knew it was poisoning people's brains and making a ton of money off it, but it would never admit to doing so publicly. I mean, who would? Perhaps that's because in 2017, riding the wave of fake news controversies, Facebook made a $3 billion profit, a 76% increase over the year before. Why would they admit to anything when it wasn't hurting their earnings? If anything, the spread of misinformation increased engagements, which increased ad revenue. If fake news wouldn't stop the rocket ship that was Facebook, perhaps privacy violations would. In March of 2018, a story broke in the New York Times and The Guardian that the personal data of up to 87 million people had been scraped by a Facebook-adjacent app called This Is Your Digital Life. People passed on personal information via the app, and the British consulting firm Cambridge Analytica used the info to advise right-leaning groups like the campaigns of Donald Trump and Vote Leave, a pro-Brexit group. This data leak brought a magnifying glass to Facebook's privacy issues like we've never seen before. As a result, the company's stock lost 60% of its value, wiping out $70 billion. In response, Zuckerberg suspended Cambridge Analytica and certain apps and testified before the United States Congress. The scandal ultimately ended up with Facebook paying a $663,000 fine in the UK, and was seen as a turning point around social media platforms and their access to our information. The following year, the US Federal Trade Commission fined Facebook $5 billion over user privacy violations, a record-breaking fine for a tech company, but still a small price to pay for a company that makes upwards of $100 billion yearly. Since then, Facebook's reputation has continued to plummet. In 2020, a data scientist said that the company failed to stop political manipulation by foreign governments. In 2021, Facebook was discovered to be the central planning platform for riots at the US Capitol on January 6th. And later that year, Frances Haugen, a former employee, testified that Facebook and the companies it owned knew they were causing harm to people but continued to put profit over the welfare of their users. Only one other industry doesn't care about the welfare of its users. It continues to sell them the things they know are harmful to them. And they also call their customers users. Needless to say, while still raking in the cash, Facebook needed a facelift.
It is time for us to adopt a new company brand to encompass everything that we do. To reflect who we are and what we hope to build, I am proud to announce that starting today, our company is now Meta.
Enter Meta. Facebook announced that the parent company of the social platform and all the other companies it had acquired would be changed to Meta. The new name could potentially leave behind the controversies plaguing Facebook. Because the reality is that Facebook just isn't what it used to be. A 2018 study found that 51% of people aged 13 to 17 used Facebook, a significant drop as Facebook lost out to Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, and then TikTok. Under its new parent company, Meta, Facebook has continued to flourish in emerging markets, allowing its influence to grow globally. One of the ways it does this is by enabling easy communication in parts of the world where other channels are inaccessible. For example, in much of Africa, Facebook is the internet. It's free on many African telecom networks, and users don't need phone credit to log on. Only 8% of African households have a computer, so internet access via mobile phone is critical. Facebook's Free Basics provides internet service that gives users credit-free access to the platform and works on low-cost mobile phones. And in further expansion plans, Meta is developing satellites that can beam internet access to remote areas, mainly so residents can use Facebook. Some see this as digital colonialism, a way of turning people in the global south into consumers of Western corporate content. It's a valid argument, but saying that Facebook is the sole culprit of this practice is naive. One can visit almost any country on the planet and order McDonald's or Starbucks. Uber currently has cars on the roads of major African cities like Lagos with a safety rating of 0, just to increase profits. As crucial as these emerging markets are for the future of Facebook's world takeover, Meta's plans are even more far-reaching. And they need to be, because during the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 70% of Meta's stock value eroded. This was partially due to Apple's introduction of an app tracking transparency feature, which allowed people to opt out of apps like Facebook and Instagram from tracking their data. This meant less targeted advertising, which meant less money for Meta. Of course, the introduction of TikTok can't be underestimated either. So, Meta is making some big bets to become even more powerful than it already is. The first could pay off. One of the keys to Facebook and Meta's domination has been eliminating competition. One of the mainstays throughout Facebook's days has been Twitter. Zuckerberg saw an opening when users soured on the app after Elon Musk bought it and upended some publicly favorable company policies. To an overwhelming response, Meta launched Threads to compete with Twitter, and in 2 hours the app gained 2 million users, and by the next day, over 30 million people had signed up. It has now gone down in history as the most rapidly downloaded app ever. While Meta's leadership was pleasantly surprised by the turnout, they planned for it, courting some of the most followed people on Twitter to convert to Threads like Ellen, Bill Gates, and Oprah. In an odd turn of events, users seemed so soured by one tech magnate that they embraced another. For many, Zuckerberg feels like the lesser of two evils. The devil you know is better than the angel you don't. Threads has been losing ground in recent weeks, although Zuckerberg insists that they're doing basic work on the app to make it function better, and once it's ready for a jolt, Meta will throw more weight behind it. But Meta's takeover isn't dependent on a Twitter lookalike. Meta was born from the idea of creating the metaverse, a digital world assessed through virtual reality, where you can socialize, work, shop, and more. Facebook Spaces, a precursor to the metaverse, was a VR app that allowed participants to hang out with their friends in person, while also wearing their VR headset. And who distributes most of the VR headsets in the world? Meta. Meta has purchased 7 of the most successful VR development studios in the world and has one of Earth's largest VR content catalogs. In fact, it owns so many VR-related companies that in 2022, the FTC, an agency that protects the rights of US consumers, blocked Meta from buying yet another popular VR studio, signaling that Meta's copy acquire kill plan might be losing one of its legs. Regardless, Zuckerberg is staking Meta's future on the metaverse and the digital worlds it will contain. He's spoken about a future where users adopt avatars to work in virtual boardrooms, attend digital events with friends, and shop in digital stores. The final component to such immense power coming together is, unsurprisingly, artificial intelligence. Like almost every other tech company, Meta has increased its focus on AI. However, Meta has differentiated itself by pledging its AI will be open source. Open source AI means that the company's code will be free to developers and software enthusiasts worldwide. Companies like Google and the not-so-aptly named OpenAI have set limits on who can access the latest technology and control what can be done. Zuckerberg insists that making the AI code open source will allow people to scrutinize and improve upon it. Like any AI, there is concern that Meta could be used for evil. I made a video on how AI could be a key ingredient to generating more spam, scamming, and disinformation. But Meta says that releasing the technology to the public can strengthen its ability to fight against these abuses. Nick Clegg, Meta's president of global public policy, said it's not sustainable to keep this important technology in the hands of a few corporations, which, coming from an executive at Meta, is a bit ironic. Because even if Meta shares its AI code, it still controls so many of us in ways we'll never be able to surmount. Copy, acquire, kill has been a mainstay of Meta's strategy. Facebook itself was ultimately just a copy of previous social networks, albeit a better one, which it eventually killed. Then, over time, the company made huge acquisitions like Instagram and WhatsApp to balloon its influence, and copied other successful giants like Twitter and Snapchat. What if Meta gets all the power? Then that's called a monopoly, and if you've ever played the board game, you'd know that it's not fun when you're on the losing side, and every person, except the person who has a monopoly, is on the losing side. If companies can't compete with Facebook and the docket of other entities Meta owns, then Meta gets all the opportunity. This ultimately could limit innovation, and we're already seeing it play out. Recently, there's been suspicion that Meta is selling VR headsets for dirt cheap and at a loss to drive out competitors. This is called predatory pricing, and while it's illegal, it can be complicated to prove because generally low prices are seen as good for consumers. Right now, Meta is too young to be called a monopoly, but if the metaverse comes to fruition and Meta owns every entity in it, this predatory behavior could become the norm. And consumers, us, the people who have been clicking, sharing, liking, and friending for all these years, might find it's too late to turn back. But what's the alternative? Leave threads for Twitter, Facebook for Snapchat, Instagram for TikTok? Well, certainly not the last one, because TikTok is way more dangerous than you think, and the video on your screen right now tells you exactly why.
You wake up to the sound of the alarm on your iPhone, and annoyed that you couldn't get more sleep, you grudgingly unlock your phone to see what's going on in the world, and there's an email from Amazon telling you that your package has been delivered. So you force yourself out of bed to get the package, and it's some Johnson & Johnson medicine you ordered the night before. The wonders of overnight shipping, you think to yourself. You glance across the room to see the clock. It's 8 a.m. and you have to be at work by 9. Flustered, you open your Microsoft computer to answer some work emails before getting dressed. There's no time to cook breakfast, so you'll just grab something at McDonald's on your way to work. What if I told you that every single company you just interacted with within the first hour of your day is heavily influenced in large part by one company? BlackRock. Now, I'm sure you've heard about BlackRock. There are dozens of videos here on YouTube that talk about how it's the company that controls the entire world. But the reality is far less glamorous. Here is why everything you've heard about BlackRock is wrong. BlackRock is an investment firm that controls a huge number of shares in some of the largest companies in the world. They have a total of $10 trillion in assets across the globe. That's an amount equal to half of America's total GDP, controlled just by one company. It's easy to dismiss such a powerful company as all-out evil, but the truth is, BlackRock doesn't own these companies or even own shares of these companies. Their clients own the shares, BlackRock simply manages them. That's not to say that BlackRock doesn't have any influence on these companies, they definitely do. Because they control such an incredible amount of their stock, it's possible that companies want to keep in BlackRock's good graces, so they don't pull their investments. Now, while BlackRock might not be the evil company some people make them out to be, the truth is, there's still something very shady about them. Their hypocrisy. BlackRock was founded 34 years ago by Larry Fink, and he grew the company from $5 million in value to $8 billion in just 5 years, primarily by managing money invested by large institutions like pensions, university endowments, and substantial fortunes invested by the uber-rich. Today, Fink serves on the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum, commanding the attention of business tycoons and political leaders around the globe, and his company is on the cusp of consolidating so much power that it could essentially control the world.
Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate.
The worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
The 2008 financial crash turned out to be an incredible opportunity for BlackRock. It secured an uncontested contract to control many of the banks that had collapsed. That gave Larry Fink, who was already incredibly wealthy, even more power, and a direct line to the American government. The same thing happened in 2020, during the early days of the pandemic, when the government called in BlackRock to protect the Federal Reserve from financial fallout. Periods of economic uncertainties like these were key to BlackRock's rise to power, and as the famous saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility, and BlackRock would like you to think that they are being responsible. In the summer of 2020, while the world was angry about the murder of George Floyd, BlackRock came out with a statement saying that companies had to serve a social purpose, and that they would be giving every company an ESG, or environmental, social, and governance score. Companies that promised more diversity in hiring and leadership or offered environmentally friendly policies and technology received higher scores than companies that didn't. Although this concept had been around since 2004, BlackRock became the loudest proponent of ESG investing in 2020, and in all honesty, it worked. Before this statement, ESGs were mentioned in far fewer than 1% of earnings calls, but by May 2021 that number rose to around 20%, and it has since remained the fastest growing segment in the asset management industry. People are more concerned about the environmental and social impact of companies, and that's a good thing, right? Socially responsible companies get the upper hand in an ideal world, yes, but we all know that the world we live in is far from ideal. While there's been some positive improvement, the main result of BlackRock's ESG statement has been a massive surge in companies participating in practices like greenwashing, pretending they're more sustainable, diverse, or responsible than they actually are. It's also exposed the hypocrisy of BlackRock itself, because while it claims to champion ESG investing, the company remains the largest investor in fossil fuels and war profiteering, and maintains a pretty friendly relationship with human rights violators. And it's not just BlackRock, the second largest investment firm in the world, Vanguard, is guilty of the same technique, promoting ESG investing on the one hand, but on the other, unwilling to stop investing in oil and gas companies or pull out of companies with questionable human rights practices. We see this time and time again from BlackRock. They do something that seems like they're moving in the right direction in the eyes of the public, but behind the scenes, they're unwilling to tamper with their investments, even if it's for the greater good of society. Take climate change, for instance. BlackRock says that climate risk is investment risk, meaning that investing in companies that aren't creating policies to help address climate change is a risky move. In 2021, BlackRock actually did do something about this by helping shake up the board of ExxonMobil and installing new members who promised to take action on climate change. Previously, the oil and gas behemoth was responsible for 2% of the world's emissions. Now there are new self-imposed mandates to help reduce that over time. This is a great move by the company, no doubt, but the fact that it's still the world's single biggest investor in fossil fuels makes this feel more like virtue signaling than actually trying to make meaningful change. And the hypocrisy doesn't end there. As mass shootings continue to end lives in the US, BlackRock has spoken out against gun violence and said that gun manufacturers should do more to protect the lives of the American people. But who's the largest investor in gun manufacturers? You guessed it, BlackRock. The investment firm holds a 16% stake in Sturm Ruger, 15% in Vista Outdoor, and significant percentages of other manufacturers just like them. BlackRock says it talks to these companies about improving safety, but so far, it's unclear whether or not there's actually been any policy change. Outside of America, BlackRock's US Aerospace and Defense Fund has billions of dollars invested in major weapons contractors worldwide, like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. They're supporting these companies that then get huge Pentagon contracts and use taxpayer money to engage in violence and war around the globe. Often, these weapons are supplied to foreign governments in the name of peace, like Saudi Arabia, which received weapons from the US government and used them to indiscriminately attack civilians in Yemen during years of civil war. Funding this spread of war and an increase in nuclear weapons shows that BlackRock constantly skirts its own commitment to human rights. So does its engagement with authoritarian governments. BlackRock is officially the first global asset manager to have access to China's mutual fund, leaving critics wondering, what did Fink promise Chinese President Xi Jinping to allow him to access the Chinese Communist Party's fund? To be fair, BlackRock isn't the only investment company out there looking to do business with China, but because of its widespread power, it's been the most successful in gaining a foothold in the controversial territory, which is surprising, especially for a US company. This power also made it a major player in the war in Ukraine. As we saw in China, despite its emphasis on ESG investing, BlackRock has a tendency to overlook human rights in favor of monetary gain. It's been investing in Russia's most prominent companies for years. The British pensions that BlackRock controls alone have contributed $630 billion to Russia. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, a precursor to what would become the more now than a year-long war in Ukraine, BlackRock reconsidered some of its investments in Russia, but just 1 year later, it was back to being among the top shareholders in the country's biggest corporations. Even when it became clear that Russian President Vladimir Putin was planning an invasion last year, BlackRock didn't budge, and like most other Western firms, it did, eventually, pull assets out of Russia once the war started. But think about all the money it flooded into Russia over the years. Money that the authoritarian government controlled and used in its expansion mission that led to this deadly war. All of this begs the question, how did one company gain this much global power and influence? Well, it started with technology. BlackRock's business is built on ETFs, or exchange-traded funds. An ETF contains diversified investments to reduce an investor's risk. Rather than buying stock in a single company, you're investing in a fund that buys stocks, commodities, and other securities. This practice proved to be very lucrative for BlackRock and its investors thanks to a portfolio management software it created in 1998 called Aladdin. Aladdin predicts the possible outcome of every investment and collects information and personal data on everyone who has ever knowingly or unknowingly given BlackRock money. This allows the software to predict how likely it is that a specific investment will fail. Eventually, this technology put Fink and BlackRock on top, making the company the go-to firm for ETF investing, which keeps getting more and more popular. Global ETF assets could explode to $25 trillion by 2025, meaning trillions more for BlackRock. But we don't need to wait until 2025 to see the effects of the power BlackRock has. Right now, BlackRock oversees assets worth 10% of the entire world economy. Companies like Fox, Comcast, and Disney have to consult with BlackRock before they make major moves since it has such a large share of their ownership. BlackRock and other large firms like Vanguard are the biggest investors in global giants like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. This level of ownership creates an anti-competitive environment. You feel this in the prices of airline tickets. BlackRock and Vanguard are among the 5 largest shareholders of the 3 biggest airline operators, which means that there's very little incentive to lower prices in order to compete with each other. This level of ownership consolidation reduces consumer choice and raises prices, and it also means that eventually a handful of powerful people at these investment firms could wield more power than the executives at the companies they own shares in. Even Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard, says that this kind of ownership concentration is bad. Too much money in the hands of too few will not work out well for the global economy. There are solutions that governments could put in place to stop these companies from gathering too much influence. Things like not allowing funds and ETFs to vote as shareholders in companies, or creating ownership caps that would dictate how much of a company can be owned by a single entity. The laws can be passed limiting how much influence an investment firm can have in the companies they're invested in, even if that influence is intended to be benevolent, like with the ESG. But how soon could any of this happen? Because BlackRock and Vanguard are less than a decade away from managing $20 trillion in assets. That would upend the asset management industry and intensify the already staggering ownership consolidation of the world's largest companies, sending prices through the roof. One of the biggest problems with this system of business is that the more money BlackRock manages, the lower its fees for investors, so we end up in this cycle where the best way to invest our money today creates a potentially catastrophic environment for our money and our society tomorrow. Unfortunately, most people don't have the luxury of looking that far ahead. What looks good in the short term is all that matters, and that is how BlackRock thrives. It hopes you'll overlook its hypocrisy around the environment, diversity, and human rights because it puts out statements about being a responsible company. Its future hinges on its investors not caring about these things. The problem is that many of its investors don't even know they're investors. They're simply part of a pension fund or an endowment that BlackRock manages. There are smaller funds that do support ESG investing without conflicts of interest, and there are options, like managing our own shares, that help us avoid the moral pitfalls of large companies like BlackRock. But much like how most of us couldn't live without Amazon's next-day delivery for our last-minute essentials, using these large-flawed companies is just easier. Over the past decade, the public has become more and more critical of what massive companies do and say. As that magnifying glass emerged, BlackRock made sure that its messaging about making the world a better place was heard and publicized. BlackRock's hypocrisy won't end. Its public image versus private actions will most likely always conflict with one another, but as consumers and investors, it's our responsibility to know what's happening. Taking them at their word is the easier option, but that's exactly what BlackRock is betting you'll do. That's how they've gotten this far. This is the same ignorance that allowed banks and governments to drown us in debt. Click the video on your screen right now to find out more.